Hey there, welcome to True Crime Records. Tonight, we're stepping quietly into the unsettling story of Dennis Rader, the man the world would later know as BTK, bind, torture, kill. For more than 30 years, he lived a calm, ordinary life in Kansas, a husband, a father, a church leader, and a city code enforcer. Nothing about him seemed dangerous. Nothing suggested what he hid beneath the surface. But behind that steady smile and neatly kept routine was a darker life, a man who planned, stalked, and carried out ritualistic crimes with chilling patience. He blended into Wichita so well that most people never questioned him. He waved at neighbors during the day, then disappeared into the shadows at night. Tonight, we're going to follow that hidden path, from his quiet childhood to the letters, the silence, and the mistake that finally ended his decades-long double life. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Now settle in, let your mind unwind, and drift with me into the quiet suburbs of Kansas. This is True Crime Records, and if you're new here, make sure to subscribe. A new story waits for you every night. Chapter 1, Shadows over Kansas, The Birth of Dennis Rader. Dennis Lynn Rader was born on March 9, 1945, in the quiet Midwest, arriving into a world that was rebuilding itself after the turmoil of World War II. Kansas, flat and steady, was the kind of place people expected normalcy from: orderly neighborhoods, families shaped by routine, simple values taught and learned between long workdays and quiet dinners. His parents, William and Dorothea, were hard-working people who balanced exhaustion with duty, doing their best to raise 4 boys under the weight of long shifts and limited energy. To neighbors, the Raders seemed unremarkable in the most familiar way: polite, distant, and always busy. But inside the mind of their oldest son, something different was forming, something subtle, quiet, almost invisible in those early years. As a child, Dennis learned quickly that attention was something rare, something earned. His father worked constantly, often leaving before sunrise and returning after dark, while his mother juggled the demands of the household, cooking, cleaning, and trying to keep 4 boys in check. In that environment, Dennis found himself floating between roles, sometimes the helper, sometimes the observer, rarely the center of anything. He didn't feel unloved, but he often felt unseen, and he carried that sensation with him in ways no one noticed at the time. In school, he blended into the rows of desks with the same quietness he carried at home. Teachers remembered him as a child who caused no trouble, a boy who turned in his homework, followed instructions, and drifted along academically without excelling. What he lacked in confidence, he made up for in obedience. He preferred routines, enjoyed clear rules, and felt comfortable when expectations were laid out plainly. It was structure he craved, not attention. Structure felt safe. His siblings were louder, more expressive, more willing to push boundaries. Dennis was not. He watched them, listened to them, learned from their mistakes, and quietly slipped into the background where he felt most comfortable. But this distance from others, the emotional space he created, became more than a habit. It became a foundation. His mind wandered often, drifting into elaborate inner worlds where he could imagine being in control of situations he didn't feel capable of navigating in real life. He began to see himself as someone split between who he appeared to be and who he imagined becoming, 2 versions of himself that only grew further apart with time. Kansas in the 1950s was calm on the surface: wide lawns, bicycles on sidewalks, families who trusted each other implicitly. It was the kind of place where children played freely, where danger felt distant, almost impossible. Dennis was surrounded by this sense of safety, yet carried a constant quiet tension inside him, a feeling of being different, disconnected, and unsure why. When he watched other children play together effortlessly, forming friendships and rivalries with natural ease, he found himself studying them instead of joining. He noticed details others ignored: how someone spoke, how they moved, how their expressions shifted when they were frightened, excited, or uncertain. These observations, innocent at first, would later become a disturbing part of his adult mind, but at the time, they were simply signs of a boy who felt more comfortable watching life than participating in it. His relationship with his parents, particularly with his mother, left deep impressions on him, though neither of them realized it. Dorothea, tired and stretched thin, sometimes brushed him aside or dismissed his needs unintentionally. These weren't acts of cruelty, just the oversights of a mother overwhelmed with responsibility. But to Dennis, they became moments he couldn't forget, quiet reminders that he was easy to overlook. These small emotional wounds didn't create the man he would become, but they became threads in a larger pattern, threads of needing power, needing acknowledgement, needing to be more than invisible. As he grew older, his personality remained cautious and introverted. He wasn't a child who acted out, yet he harbored feelings he didn't share with anyone, bouts of frustration, sudden flashes of anger when he felt ignored, and moments where he longed for a sense of importance he couldn't find in the real world. His internal world grew richer, stranger, and more separate from the world outside. He began to understand that people saw him one way, quiet, obedient, polite, while he felt like someone entirely different on the inside. This disconnect became the earliest root of what would one day become a double life, one visible, one hidden. And though no one around him saw anything unusual, the foundation of that split personality was already forming in the quiet corners of Kansas long before Wichita ever heard the name BTK. As Dennis entered his teenage years, the emotional distance he carried only deepened, and the divide between his inner life and his public behavior widened in ways no one could see. He continued drifting through school without drawing attention, and teachers, unaware of anything unusual, saw him as another average student from an average family. But inside, he struggled with a growing sense of identity he didn't know how to express. He found himself fascinated not just by rules, but by the idea of controlling outcomes, controlling people, controlling moments that made him feel uncertain. Control, in his mind, became a kind of language, a way to make sense of the anxiety, invisibility, and longing he couldn't articulate aloud. He didn't lash out, didn't rebel, didn't break the law. Instead, he retreated further into private fantasies where he could shape situations the way he wanted. These were not yet the dark fantasies of his later years, but they held the early bones of them, a desire to possess power he didn't feel in the real world. His parents, still busy and exhausted, noticed none of this, because nothing about his behavior suggested a problem. He followed curfews, respected rules, and remained the quiet son who never caused trouble. The invisibility that once upset him became a skill, an ability to move through life unnoticed, to slip beneath the attention of others simply by being agreeable. And he learned to use it. The growing distance inside him hardened into a mask, one he didn't realize he was crafting, a calm expression that hid discomfort, confusion, and the early shadows of darker thoughts. Yet these thoughts were not constant, they came and went, shifting as he matured, interrupted by daily routines and the slow crawl of adolescence. But whenever he felt overlooked, whenever he felt powerless or insignificant, something inside him flickered, something that told him he was meant for more than the life he saw around him. That internal flicker would become one of the defining elements of his adult personality, a place in his mind he would return to again and again in the decades to come. By the time he reached high school, Dennis had developed a persona that was almost impenetrable. He behaved exactly as people expected, polite, reserved, and reliable. He never gave anyone a reason to look deeper. He wasn't popular, but he wasn't disliked. He existed on the edges of peer groups, close enough to observe, far enough to never feel involved. He got by academically, stayed out of fights, and maintained a distant version of normalcy that kept suspicion away from him. While other teenagers pushed boundaries, rebelled, dated, experimented, and made mistakes, Dennis stayed steady, predictable, almost rigid in his routines. The structure comforted him, and within it, his hidden world grew more defined. He began to see himself as someone separate from the people around him, not better, not worse, just fundamentally different. He learned to mimic normal interaction without ever fully feeling it. He watched people laugh, argue, connect, and he studied their behavior the way someone else might study a textbook. And although he appeared calm on the outside, inside he carried growing frustration at how effortlessly others seemed to navigate lives that felt foreign to him. It was during these years that he also developed his habit of compartmentalizing, a mental separation between who he needed to be publicly and who he felt privately. Compartmentalization later became one of the core psychological mechanisms that allowed him to live as both Dennis Rader, the ordinary family man, and BTK, the hidden predator. But in these early years, it was simply a way to survive the confusion he couldn't express. Looking back, there was nothing obvious anyone could have pointed to as a sign of danger. His childhood held no dramatic explosions of violence, no moments that screamed for intervention, no traumatic events that clearly shaped his future. Instead, the roots of BTK formed slowly and quietly, buried beneath layers of routine, order, invisibility, and a temperament shaped by loneliness and control. He was a boy who grew up unnoticed, moved through adolescence unseen, and stepped into adulthood carrying an internal world no one else knew existed. And long before the first crime, long before the first letter, long before Wichita ever felt the shadow of BTK, the quiet seeds of that darkness had already taken root, here, in the stillness of Kansas, inside a boy who learned early how to hide everything he truly was. Chapter 2, A Quiet Boy with Dark Thoughts. As Dennis moved into his teenage years, the quiet distance that shaped his childhood began to evolve into something deeper, something more personal and private, slipping into his inner world in ways no one around him noticed. He remained the same polite, soft-spoken boy on the outside, the kind who followed rules, avoided trouble, and seemed almost invisible in classrooms and hallways. But behind that calm exterior, his mind was slowly beginning to form patterns of thought that would one day define the man he became. It didn't happen suddenly. There was no single moment that shifted everything. Instead, it happened gradually, in small, unnoticed steps, moments where loneliness mixed with imagination, where isolation created room for fantasies that gave him a sense of control he never felt in real life. Dennis began to retreat even more into his private thoughts, finding comfort in imagining situations where he held power, where he wasn't overlooked, where he determined outcomes instead of being shaped by them. These fantasies were not yet the disturbing ones that would emerge later in adulthood, but they carried the early structure of them, a fascination with being the one in charge, the one who watched, the one who decided. At school, he blended in effortlessly, drifting through crowded hallways without leaving a ripple behind him. He had acquaintances but not close friends, participated in class without enthusiasm, and rarely spoke unless spoken to. Teachers saw him as a quiet student who did enough to get by, never causing trouble, never drawing attention. That invisibility, which once made him feel excluded, began to feel like an advantage. It allowed him to observe others without being observed, to study the way people interacted, the way they showed confidence or fear, the way they expressed emotions he himself struggled to understand. This growing habit of observation became one of the defining traits of his personality. He didn't engage with people so much as he studied them, trying to understand how they fit into a world that often baffled him. While other teenagers worried about social acceptance, relationships, or fitting in, Dennis withdrew deeper into the quiet spaces of his mind, preferring the predictability of his internal world to the uncertainty of real interactions. At home, nothing dramatically changed. His parents remained busy, tired, wrapped up in the demands of raising a large family. They cared about their children, but discipline and structure were the foundation of the household, not emotional connection. Dennis accepted this environment without complaint. He wasn't mistreated, he simply wasn't understood. That emotional distance gave him room to disappear inwardly, forming a private world that no one else could enter, a place where he could feel significant and in control, even if only in imagination. He also grew more interested in rules, not just following them, but understanding them, enforcing them, seeing where others broke them. He liked the idea of boundaries, of order, of having a framework that dictated how things should work. And beneath that interest lay something darker, an appreciation for the power behind rules, the authority they gave, the way they shaped behavior. As he grew older, he became more preoccupied with the idea of being the one who enforced limits, the one who watched others, the one who decided what was acceptable and what wasn't. These thoughts remained harmless in appearance, just the quiet interests of a teenager who preferred structure. But beneath them rested deeper cravings for control he didn't yet understand. As adolescence progressed, Dennis began to feel an even sharper separation between his inner life and the outer world. He knew how to mimic normal behavior, knew what adults expected from him, knew how to appear calm and compliant. But the more he perfected this mask, the more disconnected he felt from the people around him. He watched classmates form friendships, join sports teams, and plan for their futures with a kind of hopeful excitement. Instead of wanting to join in, Dennis watched them as though he were standing behind a glass wall, present but not involved, aware but not connected. This emotional detachment didn't trouble him the way it might trouble others. In fact, it slowly became the core of how he interacted with the world. The less people noticed him, the less they questioned him. And the less they questioned him, the more freedom he felt to cultivate his hidden inner life. He didn't yet know what that inner world would become. He only knew that it felt safer there than anywhere else. It was the one place where he didn't feel small or overlooked, where he could imagine moments of importance and control that real life never gave him. And slowly, almost silently, these thoughts became the soil in which darker fantasies would one day grow. As Dennis continued through his teenage years, the separation between who he was privately and who he appeared to be on the outside widened in ways he struggled to articulate. He went through daily routines, school, chores, errands, with the same quiet obedience that defined his earlier childhood, but his internal world was becoming more vivid, more structured, and increasingly driven by the desire to feel significant. He began to daydream frequently, slipping into long periods of imagination where he controlled every detail. These daydreams became his escape from the feeling of being unnoticed in the real world. He imagined scenarios where he had authority, where he made decisions, where people reacted to him with intensity rather than indifference. These fantasies weren't violent at first, they were born from loneliness, from a sense of invisibility, but they carried the early outlines of the mindset that would one day spiral into something far darker. At home, he continued to appear reliable and well-mannered, the kind of son who followed instructions and rarely challenged authority. But in his mind, he was beginning to build a version of himself that held power instead of yearning for it. He didn't understand why he felt so different from others, but he embraced the privacy of his internal world, finding comfort in imagining situations that gave him the identity he lacked in everyday life. As he grew older, he became increasingly interested in observing how people behaved in moments of fear, uncertainty, or vulnerability. He didn't seek to create these moments, he simply watched closely whenever they happened around him. A classmate startled by a sudden noise, a younger sibling worried about getting in trouble, a neighbor flustered by breaking a rule, these small glimpses into human vulnerability fascinated him. He studied reactions with a level of focus that others might have found strange, had they known. But Dennis was careful. Even as a teenager, he understood how to present himself in ways that kept his deeper interests hidden. He practiced masking his emotions, smoothing out his expressions, staying neutral in moments when others showed fear or excitement. This ability to regulate his outward behavior became one of his strongest skills, and later, one of his most disturbing tools. Throughout high school, he remained in the background, never failing, never excelling, just quietly moving from one grade to the next. He participated in activities out of obligation, not enjoyment, and teachers rarely thought of him beyond the attendance sheet. He fit into a pattern of quiet normalcy that allowed him to drift through adolescence unnoticed. But underneath that surface, the early framework of a double life was taking shape. He learned how to divide his thoughts, the acceptable ones he showed the world, and the private ones he kept hidden. He learned how to compartmentalize, placing emotions into mental boxes and sealing them away. He learned how to mimic the behavior of someone who felt connected, even when he felt nothing. These psychological habits would become essential later in life, tools that allowed him to maintain the illusion of being a devoted husband, father, church leader, and community enforcer while living an entirely separate existence in the shadows. As Dennis approached adulthood, his fantasies became more elaborate, more ritualistic, more focused on the idea of complete control. They were still contained within his mind, still hidden, still unacted upon. But the emotional fuel behind them, loneliness, invisibility, the hunger for authority, was steadily increasing. And because no one questioned him, because he caused no trouble and displayed no alarming behavior, those fantasies grew without interruption. Wichita in the 1960s was a calm, predictable place, a community built on trust and routine. And Dennis Rader fit into that environment with a kind of effortless invisibility that later made his double life possible. There were no warnings, no explosions of rage, no signs that his inner world was drifting into darkness. He was a young man who went through the motions of life quietly, unnoticed, blending into a world that assumed danger came from places far more obvious than the boy who liked rules and kept to himself. But behind that quiet face, the early shadows of BTK were deepening, not yet visible, not yet realized, but forming slowly in the space between who he was and who he wanted to be. The thoughts he nurtured in private would one day become the blueprint for a hidden life built on secrecy, masks, and rituals. And long before Wichita felt its first wave of fear, the quiet foundation of that future was being laid inside a boy no one thought to question, alone in his thoughts, building a world only he could see. Chapter 3: A Soldier Returns, From Military Life to Civilian Masks. When Dennis left Kansas to join the United States Air Force in 1966, it was one of the first major transitions of his life, a moment that marked his step out of adolescence and into the structured world he had long admired from the sidelines. For a young man who felt invisible, misunderstood, and uncertain of himself, the military offered something he'd never experienced before: strict routines, clear rules, defined expectations, and a system where following orders wasn't just encouraged but required. In the Air Force, no one expected charisma, confidence, or friendship. They expected discipline, and discipline was something Dennis understood. He adapted quickly to the structure of military life, embracing the uniforms, the schedules, the rituals, and the sense of belonging that came with being part of a system bigger than himself. For the first time, he felt anchored. The Air Force didn't ask him to be social. It didn't require deep emotional connection. It valued quiet obedience, attention to detail, and the ability to perform tasks without question, all qualities that Dennis had spent his entire life perfecting. Training was difficult for many recruits, but for Dennis it offered a kind of clarity. Every day had a purpose. Every instruction was clear. Every action had rules attached. And beneath the surface, he felt a sense of validation he had rarely experienced in his childhood. People around him may not have liked him or noticed him, but they respected his ability to follow orders, his steadiness, his reliability. He wasn't popular, but he wasn't overlooked. He simply existed within the system and performed as expected. This was enough for him. He built routines easily, rising with the early morning calls, performing drills with rigid consistency, completing inspections with quiet precision. And the more he adapted to that environment, the more he embraced the identity it gave him. The Air Force made him feel competent. It gave him structure, responsibility, and a sense of belonging he'd been searching for his entire life. But beneath that calm, disciplined exterior, reflections of his earlier fantasies of control continued to linger, shaped and sharpened by the very structure he found comforting. The longer he served, the more he internalized the values of order and authority, and the more he linked his sense of self to systems where power was clearly defined. Yet he remained emotionally distant from those around him. Fellow servicemen remembered him as polite but quiet, obedient but hard to read, someone who existed on the edge of social circles, participating but never truly connecting. He performed well enough to avoid reprimand and blended in enough to avoid attention, the same survival mechanisms he had used throughout childhood and adolescence. It was during this period that Dennis began to understand something important about himself. He didn't just like structure, he needed it. Without structure, he felt adrift. Without rules, he felt uncertain. And without control, something inside him grew restless, unsettled. The Air Force gave him control in ways that real life never had. It told him where to be, when to be there, how to act, and how to present himself. It rewarded order and punished deviation. It created an environment where he could thrive without ever needing to express emotion or vulnerability. But what he didn't realize at the time was how deeply this environment was shaping the darker parts of his personality, reinforcing the importance of power, authority, and masks. During his service, he rarely stood out, never formed meaningful friendships, and never became someone others looked to for guidance. But he learned something else: how to move through an environment filled with different personalities without drawing attention, how to shift, adapt, and stay unnoticed. These skills, learned quietly in barracks, drills, and long nights of routine, would later allow him to navigate civilian life with a double identity, slipping between roles while keeping his darker impulses contained beneath the surface. When his service eventually came to an end in 1970, Dennis returned to Kansas not as a rebellious young man searching for direction, but as someone who believed he finally understood his place in the world. He had discipline, structure, and a sense of identity shaped by order. He had learned how to mimic confidence, how to stand a little straighter, how to present himself as reliable and composed. Yet beneath that newfound steadiness, his internal world remained disconnected, hollow, and laden with the early shadows of the fantasies he had never shared with anyone. And as he stepped back into civilian life, those shadows followed him home. Returning to Kansas after the Air Force became another turning point, one that forced Dennis to confront the contrast between the structured, rule-driven world he had grown accustomed to and the unpredictable nature of civilian life. He settled back into Wichita with a quiet confidence shaped by his military years, carrying himself with more discipline and certainty than the boy who had left home 4 years earlier. But beneath that polished exterior, he felt the familiar restlessness creeping back in, the same sense of invisibility that had followed him throughout childhood and adolescence. He wanted to feel important, purposeful, and in control, yet the civilian world didn't offer the clear rules or rigid routines that made him feel grounded. He worked various jobs, trying to re-establish himself, but found little satisfaction in the unstructured pace of everyday life. Supervisors and co-workers remembered him as polite but distant, reliable but emotionless, echoing the same impressions he left in school and the Air Force. He did what he was told, avoided conflict, and maintained the facade of a man who had everything in order, even as he struggled internally to find direction. Around this time, he reconnected with Wichita in deeper ways, attending church more regularly, involving himself in community spaces, and attempting to build the social connections he had long lacked. But the more he tried to integrate, the more he realized how difficult genuine connection was for him. He mimicked friendliness, but didn't feel it. He participated in small talk, but didn't understand it. He watched others form bonds with ease and wondered why those connections felt inaccessible to him. This growing divide between his public behavior and private reality widened further when he began forming early fantasies of control that blended with the structure he had learned in the Air Force. He created scenarios in his mind where he held power, where he controlled outcomes completely, where nothing unpredictable could slip through the cracks of his carefully imagined world. These internal worlds became more vivid the longer he struggled to find purpose externally. The double life, still only in its earliest form, was starting to take shape, the version of Dennis that people saw, polite and orderly, and the version that existed only in his mind, one that craved recognition, control, and authority. But the turning point came when he met Paula Dietz, the woman who would become his wife. Paula was gentle, practical, and saw in Dennis someone stable, responsible, and dependable, qualities she valued deeply. For Dennis, she represented normalcy, the kind of life he believed he was supposed to have, a home, a marriage, a family. He embraced the role eagerly, believing that settling into domestic life might quiet the restlessness inside him. Their relationship moved quickly, built on routine, respect, and a shared desire for order. Paula viewed him as someone steady and reliable. Dennis saw her as a partner who believed in his ability to be the man he publicly presented himself as. Marriage offered him something he had never truly possessed, belonging. Yet even in the comfort of this new life, his internal world continued to grow. He felt pressure to maintain the image of a stable husband, yet the fantasies born from loneliness and control followed him into adulthood. The discipline of the Air Force had taught him how to hide those thoughts more effectively, how to separate them from his daily life, how to maintain a mask so convincing that no one, not even Paula, would suspect anything beneath the surface. The seeds of a double life had fully taken root. In one life, he was the disciplined veteran, the husband, the churchgoer, the dutiful citizen. In the other, he was beginning to imagine scenarios where he held the absolute authority he never felt in real life, where he didn't feel overlooked or uncertain. And as the months passed, that second life, still quiet, still controlled, still hidden, would become the place where his mind returned when the real world felt too unpredictable, too chaotic, or too indifferent. Wichita accepted him easily upon his return. He blended into the fabric of the city without effort, becoming yet another familiar face in a place where everyone trusted the appearance of normalcy. No one knew that behind that steady facade, the inner world he had nurtured since childhood was slowly gathering weight and form. And long before he ever acted on those dark thoughts, before Wichita ever heard the initials BTK, the groundwork for his double life had already been completed. A husband on one side. A shadow on the other. Chapter 4, The Double Life Begins, Husband, Father, Killer. When Dennis Rader stepped into marriage and began building the outward life he had always longed for, he believed genuinely, at least for a short while, that routine and responsibility might silence the quiet restlessness that had followed him since childhood. He and Paula settled into a modest rhythm, one that seemed ordinary from the outside: shared meals, quiet evenings, household chores, simple goals. To neighbors, they appeared like any other young couple in 1970s Wichita trying to build a solid foundation. Paula saw in Dennis a dependable man, someone steady and soft-spoken, someone who followed rules and prioritized order. And Dennis, eager to embody the role of the reliable husband, leaned into that identity with meticulous attention. He found comfort in the routines of marriage, in the predictability of daily life, and in the sense of belonging he had long craved. But beneath that calm exterior, the two halves of his identity, the quiet man he showed the world and the private world he kept hidden, were beginning to pull further apart. As Dennis settled into his new life, he began experiencing the same internal tension that had followed him through adolescence, a sense that the structure of everyday responsibilities wasn't enough to contain the deeper urges he had spent years suppressing. He wanted to be the dependable husband, the respectable citizen, the steady church-going man. He wanted the normal life that society seemed to expect from him. Yet at the same time, the private fantasies he had carried since childhood were growing stronger, branching into complex narratives that revolved around control, ritual, and authority. These thoughts remained hidden, tucked away where Paula couldn't see them. He didn't understand them fully, but he couldn't let them go either. Marriage had given him a new mask, one that made it even easier to blend in, easier to hide. And the more firmly he held that mask in place, the more confident he became in living a quiet double life that no one could detect. As the months turned to years, Dennis learned how to navigate these conflicting versions of himself. He went to work, attended church, managed household responsibilities, and maintained the appearance of a man fully committed to family life. But whenever he felt stressed, overlooked, or restless, he drifted back into the elaborate inner world that had been with him since adolescence. He imagined scenarios that placed him in complete control, moments where he dictated every detail, where no one could interrupt or override him. These fantasies were a stark contrast to his real life, where he often felt insignificant, restrained, and overshadowed by expectations he didn't emotionally understand. His need for control grew stronger the more unstable he felt internally. And the contrast between the quiet, dependable husband and the private persona he was nurturing deepened into something more permanent. In his mind, he built rituals, patterns that gave him structure, mental exercises that made him feel powerful. While Paula focused on building a home and planning for their future, Dennis focused on maintaining the delicate balance between outward normalcy and inner chaos. No one around him saw the divide taking shape. He was polite, friendly in a reserved way, approachable but quiet. He volunteered at church, helped neighbors when asked, and worked steadily to support his family. People described him as someone they could trust, someone dependable. And ironically, the stronger that reputation grew, the easier it became for him to feel invisible behind it. Paula had no reason to question him. He didn't drink heavily. Didn't go out partying, didn't have affairs, didn't show explosive bursts of temper. He was consistent. Predictable. Boring, even. Exactly what a young wife might hope for in a man she wanted to build a life with. Yet behind that steady facade, Dennis was cultivating a system of private rituals that he believed made him feel whole. His identity split further, the line between his public life and private fantasies becoming sharper with every passing month. He felt increasingly dependent on that inner world to relieve the pressure he felt from daily life. And while he kept those thoughts carefully contained, their presence grew heavier, creating a parallel reality that no one could see. As Dennis embraced the outward structure of marriage and family, he also strengthened his ability to lie, not through spoken deception, but through the ease with which he concealed what mattered most to him. It wasn't intentional at first, it was simply a survival skill he had practiced since childhood. The mask of normalcy fit him more comfortably than ever, and he wore it so well that even he began to believe parts of it. Yet deep inside, he felt the early pull of something darker, something he could not fully control but could no longer ignore. And as he stood at the threshold of adulthood, building a family, attending church, smiling for photographs, he was also stepping quietly into the shadows of a double life he would maintain for decades, one that no one around him could ever imagine. As the responsibilities of marriage deepened, Dennis found himself increasingly torn between the roles he played in the daylight and the internal world that consumed him when he was alone. Paula remained unaware of the storms beneath his calm exterior, focusing on their home, their routines, and the plans they talked about for the future. Dennis participated in these conversations with quiet interest, but inside he felt something growing, an uncomfortable pressure that made him long for the moments when he could retreat into the fantasies that had begun taking on a ritualistic structure. He tried to convince himself that these thoughts didn't define him, that they were nothing more than imagination. But the more he denied them, the more persistent they became. He felt them rising during moments of stress, moments of frustration, moments when he felt overlooked or powerless. He depended on them the way someone else might depend on a hobby, a distraction, or an emotional release. They offered him a sense of importance he couldn't find in his daily life, a sense of total control that contradicted the uncertainty he felt as a husband, a provider, and a member of the community. His attempts at building a stable life only seemed to sharpen the divide between the man he showed the world and the man he felt himself becoming in private. He didn't feel able to share these thoughts with Paula, not because he feared judgment, but because he knew she would never understand the depth of the fantasies he was nurturing. He believed that revealing this side of himself would destroy the image he had worked so carefully to build, the image that allowed him to blend in and escape scrutiny. So instead, he rebuilt the habits he had developed in adolescence, compartmentalizing, masking, isolating parts of himself that didn't fit the expectations of a husband or future father. His job history became a reflection of his internal instability. He moved between positions, searching for the sense of authority and structure he had found in the Air Force but rarely finding it in civilian roles. Supervisors described him as reliable, yet distant, efficient, yet difficult to connect with. His inability to fit into the social dynamics of workplaces frustrated him, leaving him feeling unappreciated and unrecognized. And whenever that frustration bubbled up, he retreated into his private world, imagining himself as someone important, someone feared, someone with power. His desire for control intensified the more he felt powerless in real life. He wanted control over his environment, over how others saw him, over the parts of his identity he couldn't fully articulate. He became obsessed with the idea of holding power quietly, invisibly, of shaping a life where he dictated the terms completely. These thoughts planted the earliest roots of the persona that would later become BTK. Not through violent acts, not yet, but through the belief that power was something he deserved, something he needed, something he could not live without. It was during this period that he began forming rules for himself, private codes that gave him a sense of structure in the absence of the rigid military discipline he missed. He kept lists, made notes, organized his belongings compulsively, and created rituals that gave him a feeling of control over small parts of daily life. These habits seemed harmless, just quirks, routines, preferences. But to Dennis, they were something more, a system that made his two identities coexist without colliding. His marriage added another layer to this psychological divide. Being viewed as a responsible husband reinforced the mask he wore, giving him more cover to hide the shadows he nurtured internally. The more people trusted him, the more secure he felt in protecting the parts of himself that no one else saw. Years later, investigators would marvel at how seamlessly he moved between these two identities, how the man who attended church meetings and served his community could also carry thoughts and fantasies built on control and domination. But the foundations of that contradiction were forming now, in the early years of his marriage, as he learned how to live one life in public and another entirely in his mind. His internal world grew heavier, more insistent, more complex. And though he had not yet crossed the line into the actions that would one day define him, the seeds of that transformation were already deeply rooted. Dennis Rader was becoming two people, the dependable husband who blended perfectly into Wichita, and the quiet shadow who fed on fantasies of control. And long before the world met BTK, long before Wichita felt its first wave of fear, the man behind the mask was already beginning to take shape. Chapter 5, The Otero Case, Terror Arrives in Wichita. On the cold January morning when Wichita first awakened to the horror that would eventually be tied to the initials BTK, the city had no sense that its peaceful routine was about to fracture. Life in the 1970s Midwest was steady, predictable, and built on the idea that neighbors looked out for one another. Families trusted that their homes were safe havens, that mornings unfolded the same way they always had, children getting ready for school, parents gathering breakfast plates, the comfortable hum of a normal household. But on January 15, 1974, that sense of safety broke quietly and suddenly when a family failed to appear for their daily routines. People noticed small things first: children who didn't show up to class, a driveway that should have been empty but wasn't, a silence where there was usually noise. It didn't take long for concern to grow, and when a family friend eventually entered the Otero home to check on them, everything changed. Wichita police responded within minutes, and as officers stepped through the doorway, the atmosphere of the house felt wrong, cold, still, and unnervingly quiet. There was no sign of forced entry, no obvious explanation for the eerie silence. That detail alone sent a ripple of confusion through the officers. Inside, they found a crime scene unlike anything the small police department had ever encountered. While the details of the scene would remain sealed from the public for years, the impact was immediate. Something horrific had happened, and it shattered every assumption Wichita held about safety. Officers worked with slow, methodical care, their footsteps cautious as they moved from room to room. Nothing about the house suggested chaos. Instead, it reflected a kind of chilling intentionality, objects placed where they did not belong, items missing that should have been there, and subtle signs that whoever had been inside had taken their time. Investigators felt instantly that this was not a random act of violence. It was planned, purposeful, controlled. And that realization hit harder than anything else. As detectives gathered evidence, the air inside the Otero home grew heavier with the weight of what they were witnessing. Outside, word spread through the neighborhood in whispers. Parents pulled their children back indoors, windows closed, and the once friendly streets filled with quiet fear. Wichita, a city where everyone believed danger came from somewhere else, suddenly found itself face to face with a threat that came from within. Detectives began moving cautiously through the early hours of investigation, interviewing neighbors, documenting the scene, and trying to find any clue that could explain how such a tragedy had arrived without warning. Some residents had noticed a man walking through the neighborhood in recent weeks, quiet, unremarkable, searching for nothing in particular. Others recalled seeing unfamiliar cars on the street. But there was nothing concrete, nothing that pointed to a clear suspect. The Oteros had been a well-respected family, friendly, warm, and deeply involved in their community. There was no conflict, no danger surrounding them. Which made the crime even more baffling. Wichita detectives quickly realized they were dealing with a case that broke all their expectations. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong. It wasn't an argument turned violent. It wasn't impulsive. It was calculated, and the precision of the scene left detectives shaken. In those first hours, officers moved with a sense of dread that something larger was at play, something they didn't yet understand. For Wichita residents, news of the death spread with a chilling effect. Parents held their children closer. Doors that had never been locked during the day were suddenly bolted. People who had felt safe walking to school or leaving windows open at night began rethinking their routines. It wasn't just the tragedy itself that frightened them, it was the idea that someone had planned this, that the person responsible was capable of calm, deliberate action, and that they had walked back into the world unnoticed. Behind the scenes, detectives tried to build a timeline: who had last seen the family alive, what time neighbors heard unusual noises, what items were missing, what details of the scene revealed intention rather than chaos. The more they looked, the more structured everything seemed. And structure is what disturbed them most. This wasn't violence born from emotion. This was violence born from control. Investigators didn't know it yet, but this was their introduction to the mind of a man who had spent years rehearsing fantasies of power and ritual. A man whose desire for control extended beyond the act itself. A man who wanted recognition. A man who would soon give himself a name, BTK. But in those early hours, detectives felt nothing but confusion and dread as they sifted through evidence, unaware that this case marked the beginning of one of the most unsettling chapters in Kansas history. Wichita, still unaware of what lay ahead, had taken its first step into a nightmare that would last for decades. The investigation into the Otero case intensified immediately, with detectives working around the clock to analyze every detail of the home, every footprint, every fiber, every scrap of possible evidence. Wichita's police force, experienced in handling everyday incidents typical of a mid-sized city, suddenly found themselves entangled in a case that defied their training. The first thing that troubled them was the level of control the perpetrator had displayed. Whoever had done this seemed calm, patient, and disturbingly organized. Detectives exchanged uneasy glances as they realized how little they understood about the person they were now hunting. As the hours passed, more investigators arrived, each contributing knowledge, theories, and questions. Why this family? Why this neighborhood? Why this level of planning? The house showed no signs of panic or chaos from the killer's side. It was as if he had moved through the home with a confidence that chilled even the most seasoned officers. He had taken his time. He had prepared. And worst of all, he had left almost nothing behind that pointed clearly to his identity. The discovery ignited immediate fear across Wichita, but it also sparked something else: pressure. The police felt the weight of an entire city looking to them for answers. Reporters gathered outside the department, phones rang endlessly, and every resident seemed to have a theory or suspicion. But the more police dug, the more baffling the case became. Interviews with friends and neighbors led nowhere. No one had seen the Oteros arguing with anyone. No one could recall suspicious activity near their house other than vague memories of a quiet stranger or a car that seemed out of place. Detectives expanded their search radius, checking nearby fields, alleys, and streets, hoping to find discarded items or tracks that could tie someone to the crime. But each lead fizzled out quickly. Inside the station, investigators gathered around maps, reports, and photos, trying to piece together a timeline that made sense. What disturbed them most was the impression that the killer had enjoyed exerting control. It was not a frenzy. It was not impulsive. It was something else entirely, something methodical. FBI consultants were eventually brought in, not because the case was federal, but because Wichita detectives hoped someone had seen a case like this before. But even federal experts had little to offer. Cases involving this level of planning were rare, especially from someone who had no known criminal history. Wichita was dealing a new kind of threat, long before the term serial killer became widely understood. As the investigation moved into its second week, officers faced another unnerving reality: their suspect had simply disappeared into the normal flow of city life. He wasn't a drifter. He wasn't a stranger passing through. He was someone who knew the neighborhood well enough to move confidently. He was someone who displayed patience, precision, and self-control. And above all, he was someone who felt no need to rush. This absence of panic told detectives something crucial: he would likely strike again. The Otero case wasn't a one-time outburst, it was the calculated act of someone who had been waiting for the opportunity to express long-held fantasies. And when he was finished, he slipped back into his daily life as if nothing had happened. A coworker might have passed him at the grocery store. A neighbor might have waved at him across the street. Someone might have chatted with him at church. That realization unsettled detectives more than anything else. Wichita wasn't looking for an outsider, they were looking for someone who blended into everyday life. Someone who looked ordinary. Someone no one suspected. As days turned into weeks, the pressure to find answers only intensified. The case dominated newspapers, television broadcasts, and local conversation. Parents refused to let their children walk to school alone. Windows were secured, locks replaced, routines changed. Wichita had never felt fear like this, and no one knew how to make it stop. Behind the scenes, detectives continued working through stacks of reports, transcripts, and evidence logs. They examined footprints, rope fibers, handwritten items, and phone records. Nothing pointed clearly to one suspect. But the feeling lingered: this was not over. Whoever had done this had achieved exactly the kind of control he craved. And in that victory, he had awakened something inside himself that would not fade quietly. The Otero case marked the birth of a predator who would soon name himself BTK, a man who believed that control, fear, and identity were pieces of a ritual only he understood. Wichita did not yet know it, but the nightmare had only begun. Chapter 6: Letters from the Darkness, The Birth of BTK. In the months following the Otero case, Wichita lived in a state of quiet dread, a tension that hovered over the city even as daily life tried to return to some sense of normalcy. But beneath that thin surface of routine, detectives carried the weight of an unsolved case that kept them awake at night. They had seen enough controlled, deliberate behavior in the Otero house to know one thing with chilling certainty: the person responsible had not finished. But what they didn't expect was how he would choose to introduce himself. While the public saw detectives working tirelessly, the investigators themselves felt as if they were operating in a kind of darkness, unsure what direction the case would take next. And then, almost as if he sensed their frustration, Wichita's unknown killer made the first move. It began quietly, with a letter hidden inside a library book at Wichita State University. It was discovered not by police, but by someone browsing through a stack of materials related to the Otero investigation. At first glance, the handwriting looked erratic, careful in some places, uneven in others, as if the writer couldn't decide whether he wanted to be meticulous or chaotic. But the tone was unmistakable. This was someone who wanted attention, someone desperate to be recognized, someone who believed that what he had done deserved an audience. The letter made its way to police, and when detectives gathered around to read it, a heavy silence settled over the room. The writer claimed responsibility. He described aspects of the Otero case the public did not know, details only the killer or the police could have been aware of. And he used phrases that made investigators deeply uneasy. He spoke about control. About planning. About enjoying the anticipation. His words weren't hurried or emotional, they were cold, calculated, and designed to provoke. Detectives studied the letter for hours, dissecting each sentence. Each word choice, each stylistic quirk. It wasn't just a confession, it was a performance. Whoever had written it wanted to be seen, wanted to direct the narrative, wanted to remind Wichita that he was still out there. And then came the moment that cemented everything. Near the end of the letter, almost casually, he offered a name he wished to be known by: BTK. Bind. Torture. Kill. Detectives stared at those 3 words in disbelief. It wasn't just a name, it was a signature, a declaration of identity, a brand. It was as if he were creating a character for himself, a persona built from the darkest parts of his fantasies. This wasn't typical behavior for killers. It wasn't common for someone to name themselves, to claim ownership in such a deliberate, theatrical way. It reflected a craving that investigators recognized immediately: this person wanted a legacy. He wanted to exist in the minds of the public. He wanted his name spoken. And giving himself initials, something sharp, memorable, unsettling, was his way of ensuring that. The letter shook the police department, not only because it confirmed their fears but because it signaled a shift in the killer's behavior. He wasn't content with silence anymore. He wanted dialogue. He wanted to be heard. He wanted to insert himself into the investigation and guide it, taunt it, shape it. It was a power play, and detectives knew it. Behind closed doors, they debated what this meant. Was he escalating? Was he preparing to strike again? Was this simply a release of pressure, or was it a prelude to something bigger? Every investigator had theories, but none of them could deny the same truth: BTK was watching them. He was gauging their reactions. He wanted to see the fear he caused. And while the public received only vague updates about the case, the department's internal tension grew sharper. The FBI analyzed the letter, studying syntax, linguistic patterns, spelling errors, reference points. They tried to determine if the writer was educated, if he was attempting to mimic a certain style, if he was trying to throw them off with inconsistencies. What they concluded disturbed them more: the writer was disciplined, deliberate, and highly self-aware. Even his mistakes felt intentional. Wichita, still reeling from the Otero murders, now faced something even more terrifying: a killer who didn't just act in the shadows but wanted to reach through the darkness and speak. And he wanted the city to speak his name. For Dennis Rader, this moment was transformative. The letter wasn't an impulsive action. It was the culmination of years of fantasy, years of imagining how he would finally reveal the persona he had built inside his mind. Publicly naming himself BTK allowed him to feel real in a way he hadn't before. It gave him a sense of identity, recognition, and power that his everyday life never provided. While he attended church, worked at his job, and returned to his family each night, he carried the secret knowledge that he had created something larger than himself, a shadow that hovered over an entire city. And that shadow was watching, waiting for the next move. In the days following BTK's first letter, Wichita felt itself tightening under a pressure that no one could fully describe. The police tried to keep the contents of the letter confidential, sharing only small portions with the media in hopes of preventing panic. But even without the full details, the public sensed that something had shifted. The idea of a calculated killer was frightening enough, but a killer who wrote letters, who taunted authorities, who named himself, who wanted attention. That was something entirely different. Inside the police department, the arrival of the letter created a strange mixture of progress and dread. On one hand, they finally had communication from the suspect, something concrete to analyze. On the other, they knew communication meant the killer was becoming bolder. Investigators sat around conference tables late into the night, reviewing the letter line by line. They studied the language patterns, the references, the tone. They consulted experts in forensic linguistics and abnormal psychology. Yet despite all their expertise, they couldn't determine who BTK was. Not even close. The killer seemed to have an unusual degree of patience. His letter wasn't rushed. It wasn't frantic. It was methodical. He had taken the time to craft it. He had chosen his words intentionally. And the structure of his sentences suggested someone who enjoyed the process of writing as much as the content itself. That kind of mindset told investigators something crucial: BTK saw himself as a storyteller. He didn't just want to commit crimes, he wanted to narrate them, shape them, present them. That craving for attention made him unpredictable. Some detectives theorized that the letter might signal a cooling-off period, a way for the killer to relive his actions without needing to strike again immediately. Others feared it was the opposite, that writing the letter was just the beginning, a way for him to build anticipation for his next act. And while the detectives debated, the city held its breath. Meanwhile, Dennis Rader moved through his daily routines with practiced calm. The same man who had written a chilling, calculated letter spent his evenings helping his wife with chores, reading the newspaper, and preparing for work the next morning. He attended church, smiled at neighbors, chatted briefly in passing with coworkers. No one suspected anything unusual. His double life remained firmly intact. But internally, something had shifted. For Dennis, sending the letter was not just communication, it was validation. It was a moment he had imagined for years. He felt powerful, seen, significant. He had forced the city to acknowledge him. And yet, he also felt something else, a rising hunger for more recognition. The act of writing had awakened a part of him that craved attention as much as control. He began saving newspaper clippings about the case, recording newscasts, and following every mention of the investigation. The coverage thrilled him. The speculation fascinated him. The fear excited him in ways he could not share with anyone. In his private world, BTK was becoming a fully realized identity, one with structure, rituals, and rules. He began keeping more organized notes, refining his fantasies, studying his surroundings with increasing precision. He felt his two identities, Dennis the husband, and BTK the shadow, drifting further apart, and yet more connected than ever. Each reinforced the other, the mask of normalcy protected the shadow, and the shadow fed the ego hidden behind the mask. For Wichita detectives, BTK's letter marked a turning point. They now knew they were dealing with a person who didn't view himself as simply committing crimes, he saw himself as orchestrating a narrative. Someone who believed he had a legacy to create. Someone who believed the world should recognize his name. And that realization changed everything. The investigation took on a new shape. Detectives began compiling profiles of individuals who might have the psychological makeup to write such a letter. They consulted experts in ritualistic behavior, sadistic personality types, and communication-based offenders. They cross-referenced handwriting samples from people who had come into contact with the Otero family, anyone who had been in the neighborhood, anyone who had shown unusual interest in the case. Yet nothing matched. BTK remained a ghost, visible only through the words he chose to share. And those words would not be his last. As Wichita braced itself for whatever might come next, Dennis Rader watched from the shadows of his everyday life, quietly taking pleasure in the fear he had created. He believed he had a relationship with the police now, a game of chess, a test of intellect. And in his mind, he was winning. Chapter 7, The Strangling Silence, Killings in the Shadows. In the months following BTK's first letter, Wichita tried desperately to settle back into normal life, but beneath the surface the city felt stretched thin, like a community trying to breathe through a tightening veil of unease. Police patrols increased. Neighbors exchanged worried glances. Children who had once run freely between houses were now ushered indoors before sunset. The Otero case had fractured the sense of safety Wichita once took for granted, and though weeks passed without another incident being reported, the silence itself felt ominous, like the pause between two strikes of a clock no one could see. Detectives continued to sift through mountains of evidence, but with every passing day their leads grew colder. They had no suspect. No vehicle. No witnesses. Only a letter that confirmed their worst fear, that the person responsible saw himself as something more than a criminal. He saw himself as a figure with a name, a persona, a ritual. And as investigators feared, this silence was not peace, it was planning. BTK's double life deepened during this period, strengthening the divide between Dennis Rader, the quiet husband and churchgoer, and the shadow figure he nurtured in private. Dennis attended services, maintained his job, and moved through community events with the same forgettable politeness that had protected him for years. People trusted him because he gave them nothing to doubt. He blended into every room effortlessly, using the same social invisibility that had once made him feel insignificant as a young man. Now, that invisibility was a weapon. As he went about his daily life, his mind was occupied by patterns, studying routines, observing homes, noting who lived alone, who kept their windows unlocked, who left for work at what time. These observations weren't impulsive, they were methodical. BTK was building something internal, something structured. He saw himself as the architect of a private world where he defined the rules, and these rules fueled the fantasies he had been cultivating since childhood. The silence Wichita felt was the silence inside him, the steady calm of a man who believed he had found his purpose. When new cases eventually surfaced, they emerged gradually, quietly, without the shock that had accompanied the Otero tragedy. A missing person here. An unexplained absence there. Police reports began to trickle in, none of them immediately connected, each handled by different officers in different precincts. Wichita had no framework yet for linking these mysteries together, no reason to suspect a single shadow was moving through them all. But detectives closest to the Otero case felt a familiar chill each time a new disappearance crossed their desk. Some cases lacked evidence. Some lacked witnesses. Some lacked any clear motive. All of them shared one quality, a sense that something carefully controlled lay beneath the surface. Investigators didn't announce this publicly. They didn't want to incite panic. But they began quiet cross-comparisons, looking for patterns, ropes, knots, entry points, items missing from homes, the presence or absence of personal belongings. And slowly, a shape began to form. Not a complete one, not something they could present with certainty, but a faint outline of control, secrecy, and ritual. Meanwhile, BTK watched the coverage from home. He monitored newspapers, news broadcasts, and radio reports with the attentiveness of someone tracking their own reflection. He clipped articles, saved headlines, and studied how the police spoke about him, pleased when they seemed confused, irritated when they seemed close to anything resembling insight that he fed on their uncertainty. The quiet power of being unseen thrilled him more than any other part of his double life. Wichita detectives, still overwhelmed by the complexity of their case, faced another difficulty: the very nature of the crimes made it hard to identify. Clear connections. BTK's ability to operate without leaving obvious signs of forced entry or motive left investigators grasping at shadows. And he preferred it that way. Through these early acts, BTK reinforced his internal belief that he was superior to the people searching for him. The silence after each case felt like a victory, a sign that he could step back into his normal life with no consequence. He took long walks through quiet neighborhoods. He observed women from a distance. He mapped routines with the detached precision of someone studying patterns in nature. And throughout all of this, he felt untouchable. The city, meanwhile, grew more anxious. Wichita residents began to sense something was wrong long before the police confirmed it. There were too many unanswered questions, too many names appearing in the local news with too few explanations. Even without graphic details, the public sensed a pattern, an invisible thread connecting tragedies they couldn't fully understand. Parents double-checked locks. Teachers cautioned students. People spoke more quietly in grocery stores, at church, in line at the bank. Wichita was becoming a city that flinched at its own silence. And in that silence, BTK grew stronger. As weeks stretched into months and months into years, Wichita police began to recognize unmistakable consistencies linking the Otero case to several later incidents, though they lacked enough concrete evidence to prove a single suspect. They noted the presence of ritualistic elements, the absence of clear motives, and the unnerving precision behind each scene. Investigators found no signs of chaos, no spontaneous choices, no evidence of emotional frenzy. Whoever was responsible acted with a calmness that frustrated every detective on the case. They were dealing with someone who planned meticulously, someone who controlled the environment with an almost clinical detachment, someone who seemed to enjoy the intellectual challenge of staying hidden. Across Wichita, detectives began quietly assembling a task force, not officially at first, but through informal collaborations between departments. Officers from different precincts exchanged case files, shared notes, and compared the smallest details: a type of knot here, a missing item there, a similarity in timing, a pattern in the way scenes were organized. The more information they gathered, the more convinced they became that they were chasing a single individual with a preference for anonymity, strategy, and psychological domination. It wasn't just what he did, it was what he avoided leaving behind. The lack of fingerprints. The absence of logical motive. The careful staging of certain items. These omissions told investigators more about the killer's mindset than any evidence they found. BTK's restraint was deliberate. His silence was intentional. His ability to return to normal life after each incident was perhaps the most chilling thing of all. While Wichita police worked late into the night, combing through files under the glow of fluorescent lights, Dennis Rader sat comfortably in his home a few miles away, watching television with his family, mowing his lawn, attending Sunday services, and maintaining the outward appearance of a disciplined, predictable man. This duality became his greatest strength. No one in his life, not co-workers, not neighbors, not members of his congregation, saw anything unusual about him. He wasn't charming enough to draw attention, nor distant enough to raise suspicion. He existed in the middle ground, the safest place of all. Investigators on the task force debated endlessly over the psychological profile of their suspect. Some believed the killer might be socially isolated. Others suspected he might be married, even a father, someone hiding behind a family structure. Some theorized he had military experience, others thought he might work in a job that required order, precision, or authority. They were right about many things, but they couldn't place all the pieces together. Their profile was accurate, but too broad. There were thousands of men in Wichita who fit the description. Meanwhile, BTK continued to refine his inner world. He created lists, studied his own patterns, and mentally rehearsed scenarios. He wasn't acting impulsively. He saw himself as performing a role, one that required discipline, structure, and emotional detachment. The same characteristics that had defined him in childhood, in the Air Force, and in his early adult life now found a darker outlet. Wichita's fear slowly transformed into something deeper, resignation mixed with vigilance. People locked their doors, avoided staying out late, and kept a closer eye on neighborhood activity. But they also felt powerless. Without knowing who the killer was or how to recognize him, they couldn't protect themselves. And the longer he went uncaught, the more confident BTK became. He monitored the investigation obsessively, analyzing the statements police made and adjusting his behavior to stay ahead of them. He understood how detectives thought. He understood how they searched. He understood that their biggest weakness was the assumption that killers always slipped up. BTK didn't intend to slip. He built his life around preventing it. Yet even as he hid behind the silence that followed each case, the pressure within him built. For someone whose fantasies revolved around control, the act of staying quiet grew both satisfying and frustrating. He didn't just want to act, he wanted to be known. The attention he received from the first letter had awakened a part of him that craved a stage. And while he was careful not to reveal too much, he could not resist watching his own shadow grow in the minds of those pursuing him. By the end of this period, Wichita detectives were certain of one thing: the killer wasn't finished. The silence between incidents had become a message in itself. It wasn't peace, it was patience. A kind of quiet before. Chapter 8, A Killer in Uniform, the City Code Enforcer. As the 1970s gave way to the early 1980s, Wichita grew used to its own vigilance. A city that had once been defined by open doors and trusting smiles now shaped itself around fear and caution. And while the police continued chasing invisible patterns across case files, Dennis Rader quietly stepped deeper into the most powerful mask he would ever wear: the uniformed authority of a city code enforcement officer. To the outside world, it seemed like a natural progression for a man who valued order. Dennis had always admired structure, rules, and hierarchy. Now, he held a job that made him responsible for enforcing them. His role required him to walk property lines, inspect homes, record violations, and confront residents who failed to comply with municipal regulations. Though it was a modest position, it gave him something he had craved his entire life: legitimate authority. A badge. A title. A reason for people to listen when he spoke. And for a man who had spent decades feeling invisible, this was intoxicating. Rader approached the job with the rigid seriousness of someone who believed rules were not merely guidelines, but foundations of civilization. Neighbors often described him as strict, sometimes overly so, occasionally confrontational. He issued citations without hesitation and took pride in enforcing even the smallest infractions: overgrown grass, unregistered animals, misplaced trash bins. His tone, his posture, and his insistence on compliance made him a figure people found irritating at best, intimidating at worst. They didn't fear him in the way the police would one day understand, but in the simple discomfort that comes from dealing with someone who seems to enjoy their authority a little too much. What no one realized was that this job was not simply a source of income for Dennis. It was fuel. Every door he knocked on, every conversation where he held the upper hand, every moment where someone had to follow his instructions, it reinforced his sense of control. And that sense of control fed the shadow identity that lived quietly inside him. Being a code officer gave him something else too: access. Access to homes. Access to yards. Access to private spaces that ordinary civilians couldn't easily enter. Though he followed the rules publicly, the job allowed him to observe neighborhoods without drawing suspicion. He could scan houses, note who lived alone, take mental inventory of windows and doors, routes and schedules. His uniform granted him a presence that could not be questioned. If someone saw him lingering in a yard or examining a fence line, they assumed it was part of his job. This was the perfect cover for a man who wanted to move invisibly. While most residents viewed code enforcement as a small annoyance, Dennis saw it as an extension of the internal world he had been cultivating for decades. The uniform felt like armor. The badge felt like validation. And the authority allowed him to maintain the careful balance between his public persona and the private persona of BTK. In many ways, the job strengthened his double life. To his co-workers and superiors, Dennis appeared dedicated, punctual, and extremely thorough. He kept meticulous records, inspected properties with precision, and rarely took time off. He seemed like a man committed to his community. Yet beneath the surface, his motivations were not civic duty, they were psychological. Enforcing rules made him feel important. Correcting others made him feel powerful. And the reactions he received, whether reluctant compliance or frustrated resistance, fed a part of him that thrived on control. The quiet thrill he felt from this authority mixed with the thrill he felt from being unseen in the shadows. It made the line between the identities of Dennis Rader and BTK blur even further. Wichita detectives, meanwhile, noticed nothing unusual about the quiet code officer who issued warnings about weeds and broken fences. Their attention was focused elsewhere, on suspects who appeared unstable, suspicious, socially isolated, or impulsive. Dennis didn't fit those categories. He was married. A father. Employed. A church member. A veteran. He was everything their profile suggested the killer might not be. While police chased leads in dark alleys and abandoned buildings, Rader drove through neighborhoods in broad daylight, clipboard in hand, blending seamlessly into the fabric of Wichita. And as he grew more comfortable in this role of quiet authority, he began to nurture the idea that he was beyond suspicion. He believed he had mastered the art of camouflage. The uniform became an extension of his personality, an external representation of the internal structure he relied on. To the world, he was simply enforcing city regulations. To himself, he was rehearsing control, strengthening the patterns that defined the shadow identity he had named BTK. And the longer he lived within this dual framework, the more confident he became. Rader's position as a code enforcement officer soon earned him a reputation in the community, one that shaped public perception long before anyone connected him to the crimes that haunted Wichita. Residents considered him overly rigid, unusually intense about minor violations, and sometimes unnecessarily confrontational. Complaints reached city supervisors, but Dennis always had an explanation, always framed his actions as following protocol. And because he documented his work meticulously, his supervisors rarely questioned him. His attention to detail, once merely a personality trait, now manifested in long reports, precise measurements, neatly organized files, and his near-obsessive documentation of each property he visited. This meticulousness mirrored the psychological patterns investigators would later recognize in BTK. The same man who filed orderly municipal reports kept equally orderly notes in his private world, lists, sketches, and observations tied to his fantasies. Friends and colleagues noticed small quirks but none that raised alarm. He was quiet, sometimes humorless, occasionally awkward in social interactions. But Wichita was filled with people like that, men who valued routine, discipline, and predictability. Nothing about him suggested danger. Nothing hinted at the storm hidden beneath the surface. Meanwhile, the city continued living under the lingering tension of the unsolved cases. News stories resurfaced periodically, reigniting fear before fading again into the background. Wichita had developed a strange rhythm of anxiety, waves of worry followed by long stretches of uneasy silence. During these quiet periods, Rader's role as a uniformed authority figure gave him even more confidence. He watched the police search for him without realizing he was hiding in the most visible place of all. The irony fed his ego. In his private thoughts, he believed he had outsmarted the city, outmaneuvered the detectives, outpaced the fear he had created. The uniform and badge only reinforced that belief. As BTK's internal identity grew stronger, Dennis became more emboldened in public. Some residents complained that he seemed to enjoy citing people for minor violations. Others felt intimidated by his unwavering posture and stern expression. One resident later remembered thinking that Rader took pleasure in making others uncomfortable, though at the time she chalked it up to his personality. Behind closed doors, Rader fed his dual identity with increasing regularity. He used his job as a source of reconnaissance, observing homes with an attention to detail that had nothing to do with municipal regulations. The proximity to private property allowed him to mentally map neighborhoods, note the presence of dogs, examine the placement of windows, and study the routines of residents. These observations merged with the internal world he had built over the years, giving structure to fantasies that had grown more complex and ritualistic. The police, still unable to connect the dots, had no idea the killer was quietly moving through neighborhoods with official permission. Even if they had crossed paths with him, nothing about his appearance or demeanor would have triggered suspicion. He was neat, polite, soft-spoken, a family man, a veteran, a taxpayer whose biggest flaw appeared to be a slightly overzealous attitude about lawn care. But internally, Rader felt the tension rising. The longer he remained silent in his shadow identity, the more pressure built within him. The silence between cases felt like a test of willpower, one that he both appreciated and resented. His ego, awakened by his earlier communications, wanted recognition again. He wanted the city to feel his presence. He wanted detectives to follow his trail. He wanted to watch Wichita tremble again. He monitored news coverage, waiting for someone, anyone, to mention his name or speculate about his persona. When too much time passed without an update, he felt overlooked, unseen, forgotten. And for a man whose fantasies revolved around control and dominance, being forgotten was intolerable. It was in this period of simmering tension that BTK's identity evolved from a hidden shadow into a structured persona waiting to re-emerge. His job had strengthened his confidence, sharpened his observations, and given him access to the city in ways that felt designed for someone like him. And as Wichita continued to live in a state of uneasy quiet, Dennis Rader walked calmly through neighborhoods, clipboard in hand, believing he had mastered the art of living as two people, one ordinary, one monstrous, both hidden in plain sight. Chapter 9, Fear Across Wichita, a City Under Siege. By the early 1980s, Wichita had become a city split between routine and dread, a place where people woke each morning trying to live normally while carrying an ever-present awareness that something dark still moved among them. Years had passed since the Otero murders, but the unease had never fully disappeared. Instead, it settled into the rhythm of daily life, an invisible tension woven into conversations at grocery stores, whispered warnings between neighbors, and late-night moments when people checked their locks twice before going to bed. Rumors circulated quietly, sometimes exaggerations, sometimes fragments of truth, but always threaded with fear. Wichita's police department, though dedicated, struggled under the weight of unanswered questions. They had evidence, but not enough. Theories, but not certainty. Leads, but none that stayed warm for long. And as one case faded from the headlines, another unexplained disappearance, or chilling discovery, pulled attention right back into the shadows. The community sensed this painful rhythm. Residents could feel it in the way officers patrolled more slowly, in the way investigative units met behind closed doors, and in the way city officials spoke carefully whenever reporters brought up the old cases. But behind the scenes, detectives were exhausted. They knew a predator was still out there, calculating, patient, and invisible. And the longer the silence stretched, the stronger the fear grew. Wichita transformed in ways both subtle and dramatic. Hardware stores sold out of heavy-duty locks and deadbolts. Self-defense classes filled up quickly. Parents drove their children to school instead of letting them walk. College students moved in groups rather than alone. Neighborhood watch programs sprung up across the city, creating small armies of civilians determined to stay alert. Porch lights burned through the night. Curtains stayed closed. Doors that once remained unlocked during the day now clicked shut even when someone stepped into the backyard for a moment. People weren't just cautious, they were conditioned. The anxiety became part of the culture. Wichita news stations continued reporting on developments, even when those developments were thin. Broadcasts mentioned ongoing investigations, police statements, and community meetings. Some reporters speculated about the killer's identity, others leaned into psychological analysis, interviewing experts about patterns, motives, and profiles. But all of them, regardless of approach, reinforced the same reality: the city was living under the shadow of someone who understood how to hide. Detectives, meanwhile, found themselves wrestling with a growing belief that the killer might be someone who looked ordinary, someone with a stable job, a home, possibly even a family. That possibility unsettled them more than any theory they had considered previously. Serial offenders were often portrayed as loners, drifters, or visibly unstable individuals, but the crimes they studied suggested discipline, planning, calmness, and familiarity with routine. This wasn't someone acting on impulse. This was someone who lived two lives. And the quiet between his appearances made him even harder to predict. For Wichita residents, this notion was chilling. It meant the killer could be standing behind them in line at the bank. He could be pumping gas 2 cars over. He could be sitting in a church pew every Sunday. The fear wasn't just about danger, it was about invisibility. The idea that someone so ordinary could be so dangerous fractured the community's perception of safety. Wichita became a city on edge, always scanning crowds, always questioning strangers, always wondering when the next moment of chaos would shatter the uneasy calm. In the middle of all this tension, Dennis Rader maintained the facade he had perfected. He drove his code enforcement vehicle through neighborhoods with a professional stoicism that gave no hint of the shadow life he carried. Residents saw him as strict but harmless, a man who cared too much about lawn lengths and fence heights but little else. No one suspected that the uniform itself granted him both invisibility and authority, 2 qualities that made him uniquely dangerous. He observed people without drawing attention, studied homes under the pretense of regulation, and learned the rhythms of entire neighborhoods simply by doing his job. To the community, he was merely the man with the clipboard. To himself, he was a predator walking freely in daylight. Meanwhile, the unsolved cases continued to weigh on Wichita's collective conscience. Detectives held regular meetings, reviewing every detail they could. They mapped locations, compared time frames, analyzed patterns. But the killer's silence made it difficult to chart his movements. He wasn't acting in predictable cycles, nor leaving behind consistent signatures. His unpredictability became part of his strategy. And because he blended so seamlessly into ordinary life, investigators struggled to identify suspects who fit the psychological profile without also being ruled out by circumstance. As the months stretched on, fear hardened into something else: fatigue. People grew tired of waiting for answers. They were angry, confused, and emotionally drained. Some questioned the police. Others questioned the media. Many questioned themselves for living in a place where such darkness could exist unchecked. The city felt held hostage by a person who seemed to appear and vanish at will. Wichita wasn't just afraid of the killer's actions, it was afraid of the quiet moments between them. The longer the silence persisted, the more Wichita residents began to interpret it as a sign of something brewing beneath the surface. Every unexplained noise after dark, every unusual car slowing down on a residential street, every unfamiliar face walking through a neighborhood triggered defensive instincts. The city lived in a state of heightened awareness, measuring every abnormal moment against the quiet dread of what might come next. Police continued to receive tips, some credible, many imagined, all rooted in fear. Officers responded to dozens of calls that ended with anxious homeowners apologizing because the threat they thought they sensed turned out to be a loose branch tapping a window or a cat knocking over trash cans. Still, officers reassured residents that vigilance was better than complacency. What they didn't say aloud, but privately believed, was that the killer was likely watching Wichita react. And the lack of new crimes didn't mean he was gone, it meant he was waiting. Rader, in his private world, reveled in this atmosphere. The fear rippling through Wichita fed the persona he had constructed inside himself. He followed the news closely, recorded broadcasts, clipped articles, and studied every public statement by police. He felt a twisted sense of pride knowing he alone controlled the silence that shook the city. The power he held over Wichita, unseen, unnamed, and unchallenged, was perhaps the greatest thrill of all. Yet the silence that strengthened him also created pressure. He craved recognition again. He wanted to remind the city that he existed, that he controlled the narrative, that he was the unseen force shaping their sleepless nights. His ego, always present beneath his polite exterior, began to inflate. He believed he was smarter than detectives, more disciplined than other criminals, and more in control than the authorities trying to catch him. But the longer he waited, the more the internal conflict grew. One part of him relished the calmness of invisibility. Another part demanded a return to the stage, a way to reassert dominance. Wichita detectives, overwhelmed but determined, continued building psychological profiles, reconstructing timelines, and hunting for connections. They pored over earlier letters, desperate to understand the mind behind the taunts. They tried to decipher patterns in word choice, handwriting, and structure. They consulted psychologists who warned them that the killer's desire for attention could resurface unexpectedly, and when it did, it might signal a shift in his behavior. In the meantime, city officials held community meetings to reassure residents, offering advice on safety precautions and updates on ongoing investigations. People attended in large numbers, filling folding chairs in school gyms and church halls, listening intently as officers explained what they could, and carefully avoided what they couldn't. The mood in these meetings was somber, tense, and tinged with frustration. Wichita was tired of living with an invisible threat. They wanted answers. They wanted closure. But they didn't receive either. During this period, local radio stations and newspapers began re-examining old cases, interviewing families, revisiting crime scenes, and publishing retrospectives aimed at keeping the public engaged. Some articles questioned whether the killer had moved away. Others speculated that he might be in prison for unrelated charges. A few even wondered if he might be dead. These theories offered temporary comfort but no real clarity. Meanwhile, Rader became increasingly irritated by any suggestion that he had vanished or been defeated. He saw these speculations as insults, dismissals of the identity he treasured. To him, his shadow was still cast over Wichita, and the city needed to remember that. As seasons changed, the atmosphere remained heavy. Schools implemented new protocols, workplaces formed safety committees, and community patrols continued organizing nightly walks. People believed they were protecting themselves, but none of their efforts addressed the reality that the killer was living an ordinary life somewhere among them. The uniform he wore. The clipboard he carried. The polite greetings he exchanged. All of it kept him invisible. And Wichita remained unaware that the man who enforced law and regulations by day walked among them with far darker thoughts by night. In the end, year after year passed without resolution, and the fear that once echoed loudly across Wichita settled into a quieter, enduring tension. The city didn't know it, but it was waiting for something to break the silence, waiting for the next act in a story they could not see unfolding. And BTK, hidden behind his masks, was waiting too. But he wouldn't stay quiet forever. Chapter 10, The Long Sleep, Years of Silence and Waiting. The early 1980s settled over Wichita like a long exhale, a stretch of years where the city tried to convince itself that the nightmare shadowing its neighborhoods had somehow drifted away. The fear was still present, but quieter now, less a scream in the dark and more a lingering whisper in the back of everyone's mind. It became easier, month after month, for people to believe that maybe the threat had passed. Maybe whoever had haunted their streets was gone. Maybe the silence, as heavy as it was, meant peace. But for investigators who had lived inside the case for years, the silence offered no comfort. They did not see it as an ending. They saw it as a pause. A stillness with weight behind it, as if something was coiled out of sight, waiting. Detectives who had once raced from scene to scene now found themselves trapped in the slow churn of old files, fading leads, and unanswered questions. They reviewed case notes late into the night, spread maps across desktop lamps, and read behavioral analyses that offered as much contradiction as insight. Every expert seemed to have a theory. Some argued the killer had moved, some said he was imprisoned, and others believed he was dormant, watching. That last theory unsettled them the most. Dormancy implied intention. It implied patience. It implied that the killer was still out there and controlling himself with the same cold discipline he had shown from the beginning. And all the while, Wichita tried to heal. In neighborhoods where porch lights once burned through every night, some finally went dark again. Children walked to school in small groups, teenagers returned to their part-time jobs, and community gatherings grew a little more relaxed each year. But even during moments of calm, the memory of BTK lingered like dust on a shelf. It coded conversations, resurfaced during late-night news segments, and whispered through the minds of anyone awake at 2 a.m. In a quiet house. People didn't talk about him constantly anymore, but no one forgot. And that quiet remembrance became part of the city's identity. Meanwhile, Dennis Rader slipped deeper into the fabric of normal life, wearing his personas with a confidence he had never possessed in his youth. He was no longer just a husband, father, church member, and code enforcement officer. He had become an expert at blending, adapting, vanishing into routine. At church, he served in leadership roles. He attended meetings, participated in community events, and built a reputation as a reliable, orderly, responsible man. In his job, he continued enforcing regulations with the same self-righteous intensity that made residents remember him, though no one saw that intensity as a red flag, just an irritating personality quirk. At home, he maintained the image of a strict but dependable father, someone who believed in structure, discipline, and routine. His children saw him as demanding but predictable, a man who held high expectations and valued appearances. And for the neighbors on his block, he was simply the man next door, the one who kept his yard tidy, waved politely, and rarely made noise. For a long stretch of years, Dennis Rader lived this life with a kind of internal tranquility, confident that he had outsmarted the city. He convinced himself he was beyond suspicion, too controlled, too disciplined, too invisible to ever be caught. And in many ways, he was right. Without new crimes. Without new letters. Without new clues. Without new mistakes. Wichita's investigation grew stale. Retired officers left the case behind, passing their binders, tapes, and notes to younger detectives who inherited a burden they had never witnessed firsthand. For them, BTK was not a presence but a legend, a story older officers told like a cautionary tale. Some believed the case might never be solved. Some accepted that possibility with quiet resignation. Others refused to let go, even as the years stretched on. But for all the distance, all the time, all the fading, Wichita remained connected by one truth: the silence did not feel natural. It felt too controlled, too still, too purposeful. It felt like waiting. And waiting was dangerous, because it meant something could return at any moment. In the quiet years, that possibility became part of the city's subconscious, humming like electrical static beneath everything else. And in the mind of Dennis Rader, the silence was not absence, it was strategy. A period of observation, reflection, restraint. A pause he maintained not out of fear, but out of a belief that he controlled the pacing of his own story, that he could decide when and how the world would remember him again. It was a belief that fed his ego, nurtured his fantasies, and strengthened the boundary between his everyday life and the shadow world he had created. The long sleep was not peace. It was a slow inhale before another strike. As the years continued passing, Wichita found itself navigating an odd contradiction. Life grew calmer on the surface, but a sense of unfinished business lingered beneath it. Police still fielded occasional tips, many outdated, most unreliable, all of them echoes of a fear that refused to die completely. Detectives tried to reorganize the case files, hoping to see something new in the old patterns, but the cold reality remained: without fresh evidence, they were stuck. The trail had frozen. And the city entered a strange period where BTK felt both absent and ever-present. A ghost without movement. A shadow without form. People didn't talk about him daily anymore, yet everyone still understood what had happened, what might still be waiting. It shaped the city's identity, sharpening a collective intuition that something unresolved lived inside its history. During this time, Dennis Rader experienced a different kind of internal shift. The quiet years tested him. The absence of new activity forced him to rely solely on his fantasies, old memories, old images, old rituals he replayed in his mind over and over like a private film reel. Some days, he felt satisfied by the stability of his public life. Other days, he felt suffocated by it. He battled a growing desire to be recognized again, to reassert the identity that had once made him feel powerful. The facade he wore in public grew heavier, more restrictive, as the shadow identity within him pressed for release. But Rader had always depended on structure. It was how he kept control, how he maintained balance. So he redirected his energy into his routines, his job, his church duties, his home responsibilities. He buried himself in tasks, committees, logs, lists, and rules, believing that discipline could quiet the internal voices that still whispered about the past. Yet even with all his efforts, the need for recognition simmered. Occasionally, news outlets aired segments on cold cases, revisiting old crimes in the hope that public memory might spark new leads. Whenever the Otero case resurfaced on television, Rader felt a complicated thrill. He'd sit in the dim glow of the living room, listening to reporters speculate, watching detectives describe theories, hearing the uncertainty in their voices. He watched silently, expressionless on the outside, but internally, the shadow identity stirred. It bothered him to hear experts misinterpret his motives. It bothered him to watch timelines summarized inaccurately. It bothered him to hear psychologists describe him as impulsive or chaotic when he viewed himself as organized, meticulous, and disciplined. The misrepresentation scratched at his ego, chipping away at the satisfaction he had built during the quiet years. And gradually, irritation began turning into temptation. He felt the urge to correct them, to rewrite the narrative in his own words, to remind Wichita of the figure they had tried to forget. Meanwhile, detectives continued their work with a mixture of endurance and frustration. Some officers believed the case had grown so cold that solving it might only happen through a confession or a mistake. Others believed advances in forensic science might one day offer answers, though such breakthroughs felt distant and uncertain at the time. They understood that time was both ally and enemy, memories faded, but behaviors didn't. Patterns evolved, but signatures remained. Still, without new clues, the long sleep dragged on. Wichita slowly evolved into a city with a collective scar, visible only when probed, but always present beneath the surface. People moved on with their lives, but the memory lingered. And for Rader, that lingering was not enough. The silence had lasted too long. His internal world, full of rituals and fantasies, needed air. His ego needed attention. His identity needed recognition. And slowly, inevitably, the stillness of the long sleep began to crack. BTK had been quiet for years, but in his mind, the story wasn't finished. He had always believed he controlled the narrative. And soon, he would try to reclaim it. Chapter 11, The Ego of a Predator, BTK's letters resurface. The silence that had settled over Wichita lasted long enough for many to believe the specter of BTK had finally drifted into the past, but for Dennis Rader, that silence became a suffocating weight, an unwelcome erasure that gnawed at the identity he had so carefully constructed. Years of living as a respected citizen, a father, a church leader, and a city employee had helped him maintain control, but eventually the internal pressure began building in ways he could no longer ignore. The quiet years had forced him inward, relying solely on memories and fantasies, but memories fade, and fantasies without action begin to feel hollow. And more than anything else, he despised the sensation of being forgotten. What had once been a strategic decision, to step back and let the city drift into uneasy calm, began to feel like obscurity. The legend of BTK, once whispered in fear, was fading into old case files and fading newspaper clippings. Younger officers in the Wichita Police Department saw it as history rather than threat, a mystery they had inherited but did not feel the urgency of solving. And that realization irritated Rader in a way nothing else had. He had always believed he was smarter than investigators, more disciplined than other criminals, and more deserving of recognition than the ordinary life he portrayed. The idea that his legacy was dissolving into dust felt unbearable. He needed to reclaim his narrative. He needed the city to remember him. He needed to feel the tension return. And thus began the internal shift that would eventually shatter the long silence. It didn't happen suddenly, it grew slowly, like a spark in dry grass. Rader found himself rereading old clippings, running his fingers along the edges of articles, examining the way reporters had framed his early crimes. He mentally edited their words, correcting inaccuracies, rewriting statements in his head. He replayed memories he had stored. Deep inside himself, the rituals and fantasies that had once defined the shadow identity he held so dearly. The more he revisited the past, the more alive that identity became. BTK was no longer dormant. He was waking up. Meanwhile, Wichita had grown accustomed to the quiet. The police still kept the files open, but they no longer lived inside the case the way they once had. Reporters occasionally referenced BTK in anniversary pieces, but their tone had shifted from fear to speculation. They wondered if he had died. They wondered if he had left the state. Some dismissed the case as a relic of the past, the kind of unresolved chapter that communities learn to carry without expecting closure. These articles, thoughtful, distant, sometimes dismissive, found their way into Rader's hands. And with each one, his irritation deepened. One particular story, written by a younger journalist who had not lived through the height of the terror, suggested that BTK had likely been a drifter who moved on, perhaps deceived by his own impulses and unable to sustain the discipline necessary to avoid capture. The article stated, almost casually, that if BTK were still alive, he was probably a shell of whatever threat he once posed. Rader read that line repeatedly, feeling a slow, bubbling anger beneath the calm exterior he presented to the world. A shell. A forgotten threat. He couldn't tolerate the idea. His ego, carefully restrained during the quiet years, began pushing against the boundaries of his discipline. In response, he crafted a plan. He wouldn't return abruptly. He wouldn't act recklessly. Instead, he would do what he had always done, control the narrative from the shadows. He began drafting letters in private, testing phrases, shaping the tone, and deciding exactly how he wanted to reintroduce himself to the city that had allowed him to fade. He revived the style he had used decades earlier, strange, performative, almost theatrical. He enjoyed the process of writing, the way each word helped reclaim his identity, the way he could shape how Wichita remembered him. The letters were not confessions, they were statements of presence. A reminder that he was still here. A reminder that he had not forgotten them. And more importantly, a reminder that they had forgotten him too easily. As he prepared to send his first new message, he felt a familiar satisfaction rising within him, the feeling of holding power again, the feeling of orchestrating fear with nothing more than a sheet of paper and a stamp. Wichita police, unaware of the storm coming their way, continued living in the comfort of the long sleep. But that comfort was about to shatter, because for a predator like BTK, silence was never meant to last. It was only a pause. And he was ready to speak again. The first new communication that reached Wichita police arrived quietly, almost deceptively, the kind of envelope that could have been overlooked if not for the unsettling familiarity resting inside. When officers opened it and saw the distinctive tone, cadence, and theatrically self-important style, they felt a chill that carried years of weight, years of waiting, guessing, hoping, and fearing. BTK was back. The re-emergence of the letters sent a shock through the department. Some younger officers recognized the name but not the full gravity of what it meant. Veteran investigators, however, understood immediately. They felt the air shift. The silence of years cracked open like ice under pressure. This wasn't just a clue, it was a declaration. A signal that the dormant shadow had awakened. And in that moment, Wichita was no longer the city it had been the day before. Detectives rushed to compare the new letter to the old ones, running handwriting analysis, linguistic patterning, and forensic reviews. The tone was unmistakable, self-aggrandizing, dramatic, and dripping with the same desire for recognition that had driven the earlier communications. But something else was present too, age. Decades of quiet had loosened Rader's restraint, and the letter carried hints of impatience, perhaps even desperation. He wanted to be noticed. He wanted to be acknowledged. He wanted to remind Wichita that he was still the monster they had tried to forget. At the same time, the community's response rippled outward. News stations interrupted regular programming. Reporters scrambled for statements. Citizens who had once convinced themselves the terror belonged to another era felt old fears return. Some called relatives to share the news. Others locked their doors immediately. Many simply sat in silence, letting the reality sink in, the figure who haunted their past had re-entered their present. And yet, the new letter did something else, it reignited the investigation with a surge of momentum detectives had not felt in decades. Old case files were reopened. Retired officers were contacted for insight. Experts were brought in to reanalyze evidence with modern technology. What had once been a stagnant mystery transformed into a living, breathing hunt. Forensic science had advanced dramatically since BTK's early years. DNA methods were sharper, data systems more connected, and psychological profiling more precise. Detectives believed, quietly, cautiously, that perhaps the killer had made a mistake by resurfacing. Perhaps his desire for attention would finally expose him. But while detectives regained hope, Rader basked in the renewed energy of the moment. Watching the news coverage, seeing reporters speak his letters aloud, hearing his name whispered across Wichita once again, it fed his ego in ways the quiet years never could. He felt powerful again, alive again, relevant again. And as he watched investigators try to interpret his messages, he convinced himself that he was still in control. Still the director of the story. Still the unseen force shaping the fear of an entire city. But the world had changed since the 1970s. And Rader, lost in his own arrogance, did not realize how dangerous that change would be for him. His ego, the same force that had driven him to seek attention decades earlier, was now pushing him into decisions he believed were calculated but were, in fact, exposing cracks in his carefully constructed mask. The letters continued. Each one more revealing than the last. Each one granting investigators small but crucial insights into his personality, his routines, his habits, and eventually, his vulnerabilities. Detectives studied everything, his phrasing, his references, the materials used, the type of postage, the printer ink. Every detail, no matter how small, became a potential threat. And slowly, a profile began to sharpen, not just of BTK the persona, but of the man behind the persona. A man who longed to be admired and feared. A man who couldn't tolerate anonymity. A man who confused notoriety with significance. The more he wrote, the more clues he gave. And the more clues he gave, the more investigators recognized something important: BTK wasn't untouchable. He wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a myth. He was a man who needed attention so badly that he was willing to risk everything to get it. And that need, the ego that fueled his letters, would become the very flaw that unraveled him. The long sleep was ending. The hunt was beginning. And BTK, desperate to be seen, had finally stepped back into the light. Chapter 12, Cat and Mouse, the Taunts and the Trap. When BTK's letters resurfaced, Wichita felt the old fear stir like a storm returning after years of quiet skies, but in the police department, the shift was even more profound. Detectives who had spent decades wrestling with unanswered questions felt something electric in the air, a renewed sense of purpose sharpened by the realization that the figure haunting their city was not gone but awake, watching, calculating, and, most importantly, communicating again. For the first time in years, they had something they could respond to, something they could analyze, something that might finally break the silence that had held the investigation hostage. But with every new letter that arrived, it became clear that they were no longer dealing with the same man from the 1970s. BTK had aged. His writing was slightly different, his tone a little more scattered, his attempts to craft a persona occasionally slipping into something that felt almost frustrated. He wanted attention, badly. And detectives quickly realized that this hunger for recognition, this ego pressing against the surface, was a vulnerability they could exploit. Instead of shutting down communication, the task force made a strategic decision: they would answer him. Not directly, of course, but through carefully crafted public statements, press releases, and subtle cues embedded in news reports. They wanted to encourage him to keep writing, to believe he was still steering the narrative, to think he was educating investigators about his brilliance. In truth, every letter he sent tightened the net around him. As the psychological games escalated, investigators brought in specialists, behavioral profilers, forensic linguists, handwriting analysts, and experts in communication patterns. They formed a multidisciplinary unit whose sole job was to understand the man behind the letters, to decode not just what he said but why he said it. Every phrase was dissected. Every reference was traced. Every unusual spelling, punctuation quirk, and narrative shift was catalogued. BTK believed he was showcasing intelligence. What he actually showcased were habits. And habits were breadcrumbs. Meanwhile, Wichita watched the exchange unfold with a mixture of dread and fascination. News anchors read portions of the letters on live broadcasts, their voices steady but tense. Headlines once again carried the name the city had tried to forget. The public reacted in waves: fear, anger, resignation, but beneath it all was a shared realization that something dangerous was unfolding in real time. Some citizens called the police asking how to protect themselves. Others wanted reassurance that the killer wouldn't strike again. Many simply wanted to understand how he could still be out there after so many years. Through it all, investigators remained composed. They understood that catching BTK would require patience, misdirection, and psychological manipulation, the very tactics he believed he had mastered. And so they allowed the correspondence to continue, knowing each letter was a window into a mind that could not resist revealing itself. What they didn't know was how far Rader was willing to go. For his part, Dennis Rader monitored everything: the press conferences, the articles, the televised segments. He recorded broadcasts and rewound them to analyze the wording. He studied detectives' expressions, searching for signs of confusion or admiration. Every time his name appeared on screen, he felt a surge of satisfaction, a reaffirmation of the identity he feared the world had forgotten. And as the back and forth continued, he began to believe he was outsmarting law enforcement again. That belief emboldened him. He wrote more often. He became more careless in small ways. He referenced personal details he thought were insignificant. He asked questions that revealed insecurity behind his bravado. And eventually, he asked the one question that would become his undoing, a question rooted not in strategy but in ego. He wanted to know if police could trace a floppy disk. Rader's question about the floppy disk was phrased casually, almost as if he were asking about the weather, but investigators immediately recognized its significance. It was the first time BTK had explicitly shown interest in using digital communication, an area where modern forensic technology was far more advanced than anything available during his earlier crimes. Detectives crafted their response with extreme care. Through a controlled statement released to the media, they conveyed reassurance disguised as neutrality. They stated that information sent on a floppy disk would be safe and would not compromise the sender's identity. The moment the statement aired, investigators held their breath, not because they feared the killer would outsmart them, but because they hoped he would believe them. And Dennis Rader did. His trust in his own superiority blinded him. He believed he was still the one orchestrating the story, still the one manipulating the system. In his mind, he had returned to outplay the police once again. He convinced himself that modern law enforcement had not changed enough to detect him through such a simple medium. And a few weeks later, an envelope arrived, lightweight, unassuming, containing the single piece of evidence detectives had hoped for, a purple 1.44 megabytes floppy disk. Inside that disk lived the key to unraveling decades of mystery. Investigators inserted it into a secure, isolated system under strict protocols. The moment files loaded, they saw two things: a document drafted by BTK and metadata that exposed far more than he intended. The metadata listed the name of the person who last modified the file, Dennis. The disk also contained reference to a specific place, Christ Lutheran Church. And when detectives cross-checked the name, Dennis, with church leadership records, only one matched all criteria: a middle-aged, married man, a city employee, a veteran, a father. A man who had lived in Wichita the entire time. A man who had been hiding in plain sight. A man named Dennis Rader. When detectives first saw his photograph, they felt a strange mix of shock and clarity. He did not look dangerous. He looked ordinary, deeply ordinary. The kind of person no one notices in a crowd. The kind of person whose presence blended seamlessly into the backdrop of everyday life. But ordinary was exactly what BTK had always been. That ordinariness had protected him for decades. Now it was the final piece of the puzzle. The moment investigators confirmed the connection, they moved swiftly. Surveillance teams monitored Rader's movements. They watched him leave for work, return home, attend church, run errands, every detail adding another layer of confirmation. Detectives gathered DNA from his daughter's medical records through a legal avenue, and when the results came back, the match was undeniable. BTK had a name, a face, a life. After 30 years, the mask had finally cracked. And though Rader continued living as if nothing had changed, completely unaware that his smallest question, the one rooted in ego, had exposed him, the officers watching his home understood they were living through the final chapter of a story that had haunted Wichita for generations. The cat-and-mouse game was ending. The predator who believed he could outsmart everyone had fallen into a trap he built himself. And soon, the quiet man with the clipboard and the church title would face the truth he had spent decades avoiding: the world he controlled in his fantasies was gone. Reality had finally caught up. And Wichita, after so many years, would finally breathe again. Chapter 13, The Floppy Disk That Broke the Mask. When investigators confirmed that the purple floppy disk had come from Dennis Rader, the moment didn't feel like a dramatic movie twist. Instead, it unfolded with an eerie sense of quiet clarity, as if the truth had always been waiting beneath the surface, and now it had finally, calmly risen into the light. The task force members didn't cheer or shout when the metadata revealed the name Dennis. They simply stared at the screen, absorbing the weight of what they were seeing. After decades of uncertainty, cold leads, dead ends, and long nights spent poring over evidence that never pointed anywhere conclusive, they now had something so simple, so mundane, and yet so definitive: a first name, a church, a digital fingerprint that no amount of cleverness or planning could erase. They had BTK's mask in their hands, not broken by violence or confession, but by a line of code. The discovery carried a strange, surreal quiet. Officers exchanged glances, each person trying to reconcile the idea that the figure who had terrified Wichita for so long could have undone himself with a single careless decision. The team moved quickly but methodically, checking church directories, cross-referencing names, pulling public records, matching timelines, and confirming every piece of data they could. And there he was, Dennis Rader, a city code enforcement officer, a veteran, a father, a husband, a church council president. His address matched the geographical patterns in earlier cases. His age aligned with the estimated profile. His background showed discipline, routine, order, and a need for control. The more they looked, the clearer it became: they had found him. The extraordinary part was how ordinary he looked. His photo showed a man with glasses, a neatly trimmed mustache, and a calm, almost sleepy expression. Nothing about him evoked the terror etched into the memories of Wichita's past. Detectives stared at the image, feeling a strange disconnect. This was the face behind the letters. This was the man who had manipulated the city for decades. This was the shadow they had chased across neighborhoods, theories, and time. The discovery triggered an immediate chain reaction. Surveillance teams were deployed around Rader's home. Officers watched him leave in the morning, drive to work, run errands, attend church. They documented everything: his patterns, his habits, his movements, because even though the digital evidence was powerful, they needed more. They needed confirmation. They needed something irrefutable. And so began the quietest phase of the entire investigation: the watch. Detectives observed him from a distance, noting that he moved through daily life with unremarkable precision. He drove calmly, walked calmly, interacted calmly. There was no hint of the shadow world he had hidden for so long. But investigators knew better. They had the digital fingerprint. Now they needed the biological one. Through a legally sanctioned method, detectives obtained a DNA sample from Rader's daughter's past medical records. They waited anxiously for the results, knowing that everything hinged on the comparison. And when the match came back, a strong, scientific, undeniable connection between his daughter's DNA and the evidence preserved from the earlier crime scenes, the room filled with a profound silence. It was over. The man whose identity had eluded Wichita for 30 years was no longer a ghost. He had a name. He had a house. He had a job. And he had made the single mistake that allowed investigators to step through the wall he had built around himself. The floppy disk, tiny, outdated, almost laughably simple, had shattered the illusion of his untouchable brilliance. And now, the task force members knew what came next. The operation to arrest him had to be flawless. No mistakes. No delays. No risks. Wichita had waited too long for justice to let anything jeopardize it now. As the surveillance continued, detectives watched Dennis Rader move through his final days of freedom with the same mechanical precision that had defined him for years. He had no idea the walls were closing in. He believed he was still in control. He believed the floppy disk had been safe. He believed the police were still fumbling in the dark. And because he believed these things, he carried himself with the calm confidence of a man who thought he had outsmarted everyone again. Investigators spent hours reviewing the timing of the arrest, considering the safest possible moment. They didn't want him near his home, where weapons or panic could create danger. They didn't want him surrounded by civilians. They needed a controlled environment, a predictable pattern, a moment where he was isolated. Fortunately, Rader lived a life built on predictable patterns. He left the office at nearly the same time every day. He took the same route. He drove the same speed. He made the same stops. And so, on a quiet afternoon in February 2005, officers chose their moment. Rader left work in his white Jeep Cherokee, unaware that unmarked vehicles were trailing him at a distance. The sky was calm. Traffic was light. The city moved around him like any other day. When he reached an intersection near a local university, officers surrounded his vehicle with swift precision. Cars angled in. Doors flew open. Agents approached with clear commands. And in that instant, Dennis Rader's carefully maintained facade cracked, not with violence, but with confusion. He raised his hands slowly. He looked around, bewildered. And then, in a voice small and almost childlike, he asked the question that would stun everyone present. "Why are you stopping me?" It wasn't the voice of a monster. It wasn't the voice of a mastermind. It was the voice of a man who couldn't fathom how the story had slipped out of his control. Officers informed him he was under arrest. They placed him in handcuffs. They transported him to the station. And during the ride, the man who had spent decades cultivating the persona of BTK sat quietly, lost in thought, processing the unthinkable. He had been caught. At the police station, detectives laid out the evidence: DNA, letters, metadata, timelines, patterns. The case was airtight. Rader's shoulders sagged. His confidence evaporated. His ego deflated. And then, after years of silence, he began to talk. Not with reluctance, but with an eagerness that stunned the investigators. As if he had been waiting for someone, anyone, to finally ask him who he truly was. As if he wanted the credit he believed he deserved. The floppy disk had not only exposed him technically, it had exposed him psychologically. It proved he wasn't the perfect architect of control he believed himself to be. It showed his vulnerabilities. It revealed his need for recognition. It ripped apart the illusion he had spent decades building. And as detectives listened to his words spill out, structured, emotionless, disturbingly calm, they realized something striking: BTK had never been a genius. He had been careful, yes. Organized, yes. Patient, yes. But his downfall came from the same place his crimes had originated: a desperate desire to be noticed. Ego had always been his driving force. And in the end, that ego had signed its own confession. Wichita, after 30 years of fear and uncertainty, finally had the truth. The mask was gone. The shadow had a face. And the man who once controlled the city from behind a curtain of silence was now just another prisoner sitting in a plain interrogation room, stripped of the power he once believed would define him forever. Chapter 14, Inside the Mind of Dennis Rader, Confessions of BTK. When Dennis Rader finally settled into the interrogation room, the atmosphere held an uncanny stillness, as if the walls themselves were waiting for him to speak. After 30 years of silence and coded letters, he sat calmly across from detectives, hands folded, posture upright, expression oddly serene. There was no panic, no anger, no trace of the tension one might expect from a man whose life had just collapsed in a single afternoon. Instead, Rader looked composed, almost grateful for an audience. Detectives noticed this immediately. They recognized the subtle shift in his demeanor, the quiet excitement beneath his calm exterior. For so long, Rader had lived inside his own private mythology, convinced of his own intelligence, convinced of his superior planning, convinced that he had crafted a legacy that would confuse and challenge investigators for generations. And now, for the first time, someone had asked him to explain it. The interview began with routine questions: background, family, work history, and Rader answered each one with the same steady, almost pleasant tone he used at city council meetings or church gatherings. But the moment the conversation moved closer to the truth he had hidden for decades, something changed in his eyes. The polite mask remained, but behind it, something sharpened. Something focused. Something long contained. He began to describe his life in two parallel strands, the public Dennis and the project Dennis, as he referred to the internal world where he housed his fantasies and plans. He talked about compartmentalization, about shutting away thoughts that didn't fit the image he presented to neighbors and coworkers. He spoke with the detachment of someone giving a technical briefing, not a confession. Detectives listened carefully, noting the clinical language he used. He didn't describe emotions. He didn't use dramatic words. He didn't speak in the tones of remorse or denial. Instead, he explained his behaviors with the calm logic of someone outlining a daily routine. His voice remained steady, almost monotone, as he discussed how he maintained the duality of his life, how he could attend church, help neighbors with yard work, take his children to school, and still carve out space in his mind for an entirely separate identity. To Rader, this wasn't unusual. It was efficient. It was structured. It was orderly, a word he used often. That word, detectives realized, was central to his psyche. Order. Structure. Control. These were the pillars of his mental landscape. He thrived on schedules, rules, and systems. He created elaborate internal logbooks and categorized ideas with the same precision he applied to his job as a compliance officer. When he spoke about his actions, he used phrases like, my projects, my communications, or, my activities, distancing himself from the reality of what those words represented to the world. He never described compulsion or emotional frenzy. Everything, in his telling, was planned. Measured. Controlled. Yet beneath the surface of his calm explanations, detectives sensed a deeper truth, a loneliness that had hardened into something far more dangerous. Rader had lived most of his life craving acknowledgement. He wanted someone to see the world the way he saw it, to appreciate the elaborate system he believed he had created. And now, facing interrogators who allowed him to speak freely, he finally had the stage he had always imagined, a captive audience listening carefully, taking notes, asking questions that signaled they were following his train of thought. His posture brightened. His tone warmed. He leaned forward, offering details not because he was coerced but because he felt understood in a way that his ordinary life had never provided. This willingness to share, detectives realized, wasn't an act of remorse. It was an act of ego. A final, desperate grasp at significance. As the conversation deepened, detectives carefully guided Rader toward topics that revealed how he perceived himself, not just what he did, but who he believed he was. This distinction was essential, because while the acts themselves belonged to the criminal record, the motivations belonged to the psyche. And in Rader's mind, he did not see himself as impulsive or chaotic. He saw himself as methodical, precise, and, in a strange way, creative. Rader described spending years constructing fantasies that he treated like personal narratives, returning to them the way an author revisits unfinished chapters. He outlined how he built internal characters, how he assigned roles, and how he created scenarios that he revisited repeatedly. He referred to these scenarios as daydreams, but the structure he described felt more like an elaborate mental architecture, one that grew stronger the more he fed it. Detectives observed that his storytelling tone became animated when discussing these private worlds. His hands moved slightly. His expression sharpened. His voice took on the rhythm of someone explaining a long-term project. Yet even in these descriptions, he avoided emotional language. Everything was framed in terms of planning, logistics, method, and structure. Control, always control. When detectives asked him about remorse, he paused, not as though struggling with guilt but as though searching for the correct category in which to store the question. After a long moment, he explained that he understood society expected remorse. He understood why people felt it was necessary. But he expressed it in a detached, theoretical way, as if describing a concept rather than a feeling. He said he was sorry for the families, but the tone lacked emotional resonance. It was the statement of a man reciting lines he had memorized, not one experiencing internal conflict. The detectives took note. This emotional disconnect was not surprising, but hearing it articulated so plainly painted a clearer portrait of the psychological framework operating beneath his everyday behavior. The more he described his life, the more evident it became that his public persona had never been an accident. It was an engineered identity, meticulously maintained, carefully practiced, and continually reinforced by the routines of suburban life. Church attendance. Neighborhood gatherings. City inspections. Family responsibilities. These were not just parts of his life, they were shields designed to make him invisible. He explained how he studied community dynamics, how he observed people's assumptions, how he relied on the predictability of human behavior. He spoke with quiet satisfaction about how easy it was to build trust simply by being polite, reliable, and consistent. He explained how people rarely look beyond surface impressions, how they accept the familiar without questioning it. And as he spoke these observations aloud, detectives realized they were hearing not just confessions but insights into how ordinary appearances can conceal extraordinary danger. Toward the end of the interview, Rader's tone softened into something resembling reflection, not regret, but calculation. He admitted that aging had changed him, that the resurgence of communication had been fueled by a fear of being forgotten. He wanted recognition. He wanted his name to endure. He wanted, above all, to be remembered as someone who had challenged law enforcement and crafted a legacy he believed would be studied for decades. What he did not anticipate, detectives knew, was that his downfall would be remembered even more vividly. The floppy disk, the metadata, the careless question, these would become symbols of the limits of his control, the boundary where ego overpowered caution. As the interview concluded, Rader sat back in his chair, hands clasped, expression calm. He believed he had explained himself clearly. He believed he had shaped the narrative of his own legacy. But detectives saw something different. They saw a man who built his world on the illusion of control, only to be undone by the very need for attention that had driven him all along. And as they gathered their notes, the room returned to its quiet stillness. The mask was gone. The man before them was no longer BTK, no longer the phantom who had haunted Wichita for 30 years. He was simply Dennis Rader, an ordinary figure stripped of mystery, his power dissolved under the weight of truth. Wichita would never forget what he had done. But it would also never fear his shadow again. Chapter 15, The Legacy of Fear, How BTK Changed America. In the aftermath of Dennis Rader's arrest, Wichita entered a period of collective reflection, an emotional, psychological unspooling of 30 years of fear that the city had quietly carried beneath its surface. The announcement that BTK had finally been caught spread through Kansas like a current of disbelief. People gathered around televisions, radios, and front porches, speaking in hushed tones, some shaking their heads, others crying tears that came from a place deeper than words. The monster they had imagined for decades turned out to be a man they had passed in grocery store aisles, waved to at neighborhood meetings, or seen sitting in a pew at church. For many, that revelation was haunting on a level they had never experienced before. It wasn't the crimes themselves that lingered most painfully in their minds, it was the idea that evil had not come from the shadows, but from the heart of ordinary life. This realization reshaped the way people across the country thought about safety, trust, and the limits of intuition. Communities began re-examining the difference between danger and familiarity. Parents who once believed they could spot a threat by instinct alone became more cautious. Neighborhoods began paying closer attention to the quiet, overlooked corners of their communities. "He didn't look dangerous," people repeated over and over. And that was precisely what changed the national conversation. BTK forced America to confront the unsettling truth that the most frightening predators aren't always the ones who appear threatening. They can be polite, organized, friendly, respected. They can volunteer, attend church, raise families, maintain jobs, and blend so seamlessly into daily life that no one ever thinks to look twice. That realization created a new kind of fear, subtle, quiet, practical. It wasn't about panicking. It was about paying attention. And that shift spread far beyond Wichita. Law enforcement agencies across the country studied the BTK case, analyzing how he had avoided detection for so long, how his communications had manipulated investigators, and how improvements in forensic science had eventually exposed him. Departments revised their protocols for investigating long-term unsolved cases, focusing more heavily on behavioral patterns, victimology, and the movement of offenders across geographic regions. Analysts refined the practice of criminal profiling, learning how to better integrate personality assessment with modern data analysis. Cold case units began to emphasize the importance of preserving even the smallest piece of physical evidence, because as the BTK investigation proved, a single overlooked sample could hold the key to solving a case decades later. Advances in forensic DNA technology, digital forensics, and analytical software were shaped in part by the lessons learned from the Rader investigation. Officers who once worked exclusively with paper files and eyewitness accounts now trained in the science of metadata, communication tracing, and the digital signatures people leave behind without realizing it. BTK didn't just change Wichita. He changed the tools America used to pursue the truth. And yet, the impact was not only procedural or scientific. It was deeply human. For the families who had spent years living with unanswered questions, Rader's arrest brought a complex mixture of emotions: relief, sorrow, anger, exhaustion. Some felt closure. Others felt a reopening of wounds they had worked so hard to heal. Many simply felt numb. The years had taken too much. But across Wichita, people slowly began reclaiming the spaces that fear had once occupied. Parks, neighborhoods, and streets once associated with anxiety became part of normal life again. The city learned to breathe differently. It learned to trust itself again. It learned that healing was possible, even if it came slowly. And as the trial concluded and Rader was sentenced, Wichita stepped into a new chapter, one where the shadow that had loomed over the city for decades finally began to fade into memory. Even after Rader's sentencing, his legacy continued to ripple outward in ways both subtle and profound. Scholars, criminologists, and psychologists examined his case with renewed intensity, not to glorify him, but to understand how someone so outwardly ordinary could construct an inner world driven by secrecy, control, and manipulation. What they found reshaped the way professionals approached the study of criminal behavior. Rader's life became a case study in compartmentalization, how an individual can build psychological walls strong enough to separate their public image from their private impulses. His case underscored the importance of recognizing behavioral patterns that don't always fit the traditional stereotypes of criminal personalities. He had no extensive criminal record. He wasn't socially isolated. He wasn't visibly unstable. Instead, he lived a life built around routine, predictability, and meticulous presentation. This taught investigators and psychologists that danger sometimes hides behind the mask of normalcy, and that understanding the complexity of human behavior requires moving beyond assumptions. Rader's downfall also demonstrated the vulnerability of ego. His need for recognition, attention, and validation overpowered the caution that had allowed him to evade capture for decades. That ego, undisciplined and restless, became the thread investigators pulled to unravel everything he thought was impenetrable. The lesson echoed throughout law enforcement circles: criminals who crave acknowledgement often reveal themselves. The challenge is learning how to listen for the subtle cracks in the persona. Outside the realm of investigation, the case influenced public awareness in lasting ways. Community programs emphasized the importance of situational awareness and empathy for vulnerable individuals without fostering paranoia. Public schools incorporated modern safety education. Neighborhood associations developed communication networks to support each other with information and resources. Wichita became, in time, a model for how communities can heal after long-term psychological trauma. And as the years passed, people grew more willing to talk about their experiences, not to relive the fear, but to understand it, to acknowledge how deeply it had shaped the character of the city. For many, the case served as a reminder that evil is not always loud. It can be quiet, orderly, polite. It can sit beside you in church or wave to you from across the street. And recognizing that complexity helped reshape America's understanding of criminal psychology. In prison, Dennis Rader lived out his days as a figure stripped of power, influence, and anonymity. He no longer controlled the narrative. He no longer dictated the pace of fear. He no longer wrote letters that captured the city's attention. Instead, he lived in a controlled environment where routine was imposed on him rather than created by him, a reversal that symbolized the end of the psychological dominance he once held over Wichita. With time, his presence faded from the news, replaced by stories of healing, strength, and resilience. Wichita rebuilt its sense of safety not by forgetting what had happened, but by learning from it. The city emerged with a better understanding of itself, its vulnerabilities, and its capacity for unity. The legacy of BTK was not one of endless fear, it was a lesson in endurance, vigilance, and the power of a community that refused to let darkness define it. And as the decades continue to pass, the story of Dennis Rader stands as a reminder of both the fragility and the strength of ordinary life. It reminds us that even in the presence of quiet danger, truth has a way of resurfacing. Shadows eventually give way to light. And justice, even when delayed, has the power to restore what fear once stole. In the end, the legacy of BTK is not just the story of a man who hid behind a mask for 30 years. It is the story of a community that outlasted him. A city that learned to breathe again. A lesson in how resilience can rise from the quietest, darkest places. And a reminder that even when evil walks beside us, it can be unmasked, confronted, and finally put to rest.